Have you ever wondered how one people, scattered across the world for thousands of years, could preserve their identity, faith, and culture against the greatest odds? How did the story of the Jews begin, and how does it still unfold in our own time? In this story, we will journey together from the ancient deserts of Abraham to the modern streets of Jerusalem, through exile, survival, and renewal. A saga unlike any other in human history. Welcome to my channel, Whispered Empires, where history speaks in whispers and echoes across time. If these kinds of storytelling journeys help you rest, feel free to like the video and subscribe. And let me know in the comments where you're listening from and what time it is. Now, settle in, because our story begins at the dawn of a covenant, in the sands of the ancient Near East. The desert is silent, except for the faint whisper of wind over the dunes. The stars above stretch endlessly, a blanket of light across the night sky. Somewhere in that stillness stands a man. Not a king, not a warrior, not even a priest of his people. His name is Abram. He is old, weary from years of wandering, and burdened with the weight of uncertainty. Yet tonight his life will change, and with it the course of history. Imagine him looking upward, his thoughts swirling. He has left his homeland, obeying a voice he could not see but could not deny. He has walked away from comfort, from family ties, from everything familiar because of a promise. And now, beneath this endless sky, that promise will be sealed. The voice comes to him again, not as thunder, not as fire, but as certainty burning within. Look toward heaven and count the stars. If you are able to number them, so shall your descendants be. Abram breathes in, as though the air itself has become sacred. The stars seem to multiply before his eyes, each one a spark of destiny. He is promised not only a family, but a nation, a people who will carry his story forward. It is here that the story of the Jews begins, not with an empire or a throne, but with a covenant, a bond between a wandering shepherd and the unseen Creator. It is a covenant built not on power, but on faith. A promise that this man, who once had no children, will be called Abraham, the father of many, and through him the world will change. But Abraham's journey is not simple. He must leave again, traveling across Canaan, facing famine, disputes, and battles. He will question, he will struggle, and yet he will continue to believe. His life is a mirror of the story to come. A people who wander, endure, and yet hold fast to a promise greater than themselves. Picture Abraham's campfire in the wilderness, its glow flickering against the dark. Around him, tents rise against the night, his household resting, unaware of the destiny unfolding. His wife, Sarah, lies awake, her heart aching at the thought of her barrenness. And yet, within her pain lies the seed of a miracle. For from her womb, against all odds, will come Isaac, the child of laughter, the first thread in a tapestry that will stretch across millennia. This scene is more than history. It is the foundation of identity. Every Jewish prayer, every festival, every tradition looks back to this night under the stars. It is the moment when a people began not with armies, but with faith. A story born in the silence of the desert, carried on the breath of a promise. So, as we begin our journey, remember this image. Abraham beneath the heavens, counting stars he could never count, believing in a future he would never fully see. That future, the Jewish people, is the story we now follow. The desert sun rises hot and unyielding, flooding the hills of Canaan with gold. Abraham, now older, walks with his son Isaac. The boy is curious, full of life, unaware of the heavy silence surrounding his father. The journey is long, 3 days across rugged land, and every step weighs heavier than the last. Abraham's mind is a storm, faith against fear, love against obedience. For he has been given a command that no parent should ever hear, to offer his son, the child of promise, as a sacrifice. The story slows here, almost unbearably. Imagine Abraham's face as he gathers wood, as he holds the knife at his side. Every movement feels deliberate, as though the universe itself is watching. Isaac looks up and asks the question that pierces the silence. "Father, "Where is the lamb for the offering?" Abraham swallows hard and replies, "God will provide." The scene on Mount Moriah is among the most haunting in Jewish memory. It is not just about a father and son. It is about the ultimate test of trust. Abraham binds Isaac, his hands trembling but firm. He lifts the knife and time itself seems to freeze. Then, a voice, sharp and urgent, "Do not lay a hand on the boy." Relief crashes over him like a wave. A ram, caught in the thicket, becomes the offering instead. Isaac lives and the covenant continues. This moment becomes a cornerstone of faith. For Jews, it is not a story of cruelty, but of commitment. It is a reminder that their path is not one of ease, but of trials. Faith is not cheap. It is tested, refined like gold in fire. Abraham's willingness to obey, and God's mercy in sparing Isaac, shape the spiritual DNA of his descendants. In later centuries, Jewish tradition would retell the story again and again, especially during times of persecution. Parents whispering to their children in exile would recall Abraham's test, reminding them that even in moments of terror, their people had endured worse and yet survived. The ram in the thicket became a symbol of deliverance, a reminder that even in the darkest trials, hope is never lost. Isaac, spared, grows into the link between past and future. His life is quieter than his father's, but his role is no less vital. Through him, the promise will continue, carried to Jacob, and then to 12 sons who will become 12 tribes. And so, the test of faith is not only Abraham's, it is inherited by every generation of Jews, a legacy of endurance. As the sun sets over Mount Moriah, Abraham and Isaac descend together, changed forever. They carry no words, only silence. A silence heavy with awe and relief. But that silence will echo for centuries, shaping prayers, songs, and traditions. The Jewish story, from this moment on, is one of survival not by strength alone, but by faith that endures even when the knife is raised. Night falls across the wilderness, cool and silent. A young man named Jacob, weary from his flight, lays his head upon a stone. He has fled from his brother Esau, whose rage burns after being deprived of his birthright. Jacob is alone, uncertain of his future, carrying only fear and hope in equal measure. Yet it is in this loneliness that one of the most profound visions in the Jewish story is born. As Jacob drifts into sleep, he dreams. Before him rises a great ladder, stretching from earth to heaven, its rungs alive with movement. Angels ascend and descend, carrying light, messages, mysteries. Above it all stands the voice of the Eternal, the same voice that once spoke to Abraham. "I am the Lord, the God of Abraham your father and the God of Isaac. The land on which you lie, I will give to you and to your descendants, and your offspring shall be like the dust of the earth, spread to the west and to the east, to the north and to the south." Jacob awakens with awe, trembling. The wilderness around him suddenly feels like sacred ground. He takes the stone that was his pillow, sets it upright, and anoints it with oil. He names the place Bethel, House of God. From this moment, Jacob's destiny shifts. No longer just a fugitive, he becomes the bearer of the covenant, the next thread in the tapestry. But Jacob's story does not end with a dream. It is through him that the Jewish people begin to take their shape. He will marry, struggle, and father 12 sons. These sons will not merely be a family, they will become the tribes of Israel, the roots of a nation that will endure across millennia. The dream of the ladder is more than a vision. It is a symbol. The ladder connects heaven and earth, spirit and flesh, divine promise and human struggle. For the Jewish people, it becomes a reminder that their journey is never just about survival on the ground, but about reaching upward, toward something greater. Life is lived in both realms, the earthly and the sacred bound together in covenant. Generations of Jews would cling to Jacob's story, seeing in it a reflection of their own wanderings. Like Jacob, they often fled in fear, unsure of what awaited them. Like Jacob, they found themselves in strange lands, dreaming of promises not yet fulfilled. And like Jacob, they believed that even in the loneliest wilderness, the ground beneath them could be holy. Jacob's transformation continues in his later years, when he wrestles through the night with a mysterious figure. Perhaps man, perhaps angel, perhaps God himself. From that struggle, Jacob earns a new name, Israel, one who struggles with God. That name becomes the identity of his people, marking them forever as those who wrestle, endure, and cling to faith through struggle. So in Jacob's dream, we see the birth of a people. Not yet a nation, not yet powerful, but destined to carry a story greater than themselves. And as the latter fades back into the night sky, we glimpse the path ahead. A path where every rung is a test, every step a journey, and every dream a promise of survival. The story now shifts to one of Jacob's sons, Joseph, the dreamer. From the moment of his youth, Joseph is set apart. He wears the coat of many colors given by his father, a symbol of love but also of rivalry. His brothers resent him not only for the gift but for his dreams. Dreams where sheaves of wheat bow before him, where the sun, moon, and stars bend low in his honor. To them, Joseph is arrogant. To Joseph, the dreams are destiny. One day, far from home, envy takes its sharpest form. The brothers seize Joseph, strip him of his robe, and cast him into a pit. They debate his fate, death or slavery. In the end, greed wins. They sell him to passing traders, who drag him in chains toward Egypt. The coat is stained with goat's blood, brought back to Jacob as false proof of death. Jacob weeps for the son he believes lost, his grief heavy as night. Joseph's journey, however, is only beginning. In Egypt, he endures betrayal again. Sold as a slave, falsely accused, thrown into prison. Yet even in darkness, his gift of dreams remains. He interprets the visions of fellow prisoners, predicting freedom for one and death for another. His accuracy reaches the ears of Pharaoh himself, who is tormented by dreams no one can explain. Summoned from the prison, Joseph stands before Pharaoh, humbled but confident. He listens to the dreams. 7 fat cows devoured by 7 lean ones, 7 full ears of grain swallowed by 7 thin. Joseph declares their meaning. 7 years of abundance will be followed by 7 years of famine. Pharaoh, struck by his wisdom, elevates Joseph from prisoner to vizier, second only to the throne. The pit has given way to the palace. But Joseph's story is not only about survival or power, it is about reconciliation. Years later, when famine spreads across the land, his brothers arrive in Egypt seeking food. They do not recognize the man before them, the ruler dressed in Egyptian splendor, speaking through interpreters. Yet Joseph knows them. The moment is heavy with choice, revenge or mercy. Tears break the mask. Joseph reveals himself, his voice trembling. "I am Joseph, your brother, whom you sold into Egypt." Fear floods his brothers' faces, but Joseph's next words change everything. "Do not be distressed, for God sent me before you to preserve life. What was once betrayal has become providence. What was once cruelty has become survival for an entire people." Through Joseph, the children of Israel enter Egypt. They come not as beggars, but as honored guests, sheltered during famine. Jacob is reunited with his son, his tears of sorrow transformed into joy. The family is whole again, yet in their settlement lies the seed of future trials. For in Egypt, the descendants of Jacob will one day know slavery. Their cries will rise from oppression, and a deliverer will be called. But before that chapter begins, Joseph's journey stands as a testament that what others mean for harm, destiny can turn to good. His pit became a throne, his suffering became salvation. And through him, the Jewish story moves forward, deeper into Egypt, and closer to the shaping fire of Exodus. Generations have passed since Joseph's rise to power. What was once a land of refuge has slowly become a land of chains. The children of Israel, once honored guests, now number in the hundreds of thousands. Their presence, once welcomed, is now feared. A new Pharaoh rises, one who remembers nothing of Joseph, one who sees only a threat growing within his borders. "Behold," he says to his council, "the Israelites are too numerous. If war breaks out, they might join our enemies." Fear becomes policy. Suspicion becomes slavery. The Israelites are forced into backbreaking labor, building cities for a ruler who despises them. The desert winds carry the sound of the whip, the cries of exhausted laborers, and the prayers whispered in darkness. Yet even under oppression, the covenant endures. The people multiply despite Pharaoh's cruelty, their resilience a quiet defiance. And so Pharaoh takes a darker step. He orders the death of every male Hebrew infant, casting their bodies into the Nile. It is genocide, a calculated attempt to crush a people before they can rise. But destiny, as it always does, weaves hope from despair. Among the condemned is a newborn boy, hidden by his mother for 3 months. When she can hide him no longer, she places him in a basket and sets him adrift on the river. A desperate prayer wrapped in reeds and pitch. The river carries him to the daughter of Pharaoh, who lifts the crying child from the water. She names him Moses, drawn out, and raises him as her own within the palace walls. Moses grows between two worlds, Hebrew by birth, Egyptian by upbringing. He walks the halls of power but hears the cries of his people. One day he witnesses an Egyptian beating a Hebrew slave. Rage overwhelms him and he strikes the oppressor down. Fleeing for his life, Moses escapes into the wilderness, a fugitive with no home. It is there, far from the palaces of Egypt, that destiny calls again. Amid the silence of the desert, Moses encounters a bush that burns but is not consumed. From its flames speaks the voice that once spoke to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. I have heard the cries of my people. I will send you to Pharaoh, and you will bring them out of Egypt. Moses protests. He is unworthy, slow of speech, unfit for such a task. But the command is clear. The time of bondage is ending. This moment, the birth of Moses, the suffering of the people, the promise of deliverance, marks the close of the first chapter of the Jewish story. It is a story that began with stars and promises, with dreams and covenants, and now stands on the edge of liberation. From the depths of slavery will rise a nation, forged not by kings but by faith, not by power but by purpose. The next chapter will tell of plagues and miracles, of seas that part and mountains that burn with divine fire. But for now, the children of Israel wait in the shadows of Egypt, their hearts clinging to a promise made centuries before, a promise that their story is far from over. The air of Egypt grows heavy, thick with tension. In the halls of Pharaoh's palace, gold and stone gleam under torchlight. Here, rulers see themselves as gods, men of absolute power, their word law. But into this place of authority walks a fugitive shepherd, now returned from the wilderness. Moses, accompanied by his brother Aaron. Their mission is bold, unthinkable, to confront the throne of Egypt itself. Thus says the Lord, the God of Israel. Moses declares, his voice steady though his hands tremble, "Let my people go, that they may hold a feast to me in the wilderness." Pharaoh laughs, his pride filling the chamber. Who is the Lord, that I should obey his voice? I do not know this God, and I will not let Israel go. With that refusal, the stage is set for a confrontation between a mortal king and the eternal. What follows is not just a battle of wills, but a display of power that shakes the very order of nature. The Nile, lifeblood of Egypt, turns to blood. Frogs swarm the land, gnats fill the air, swarms of flies descend. Livestock die, boils afflict the skin, hail shatters crops, locusts devour what remains, and darkness swallows the land for 3 long days. Each plague is more than punishment. It is a message. Every blow strikes at the heart of Egyptian gods, the river, the animals, the sun itself. One by one, Pharaoh's deities fall silent before the God of Israel. And yet, Pharaoh's heart hardens. With each sign, his pride deepens, his grip tightens. He refuses to yield, even as his people suffer. But the final plague is unlike any before, the death of the firstborn. On that night, terror spreads through Egypt. From the palace to the prison, no household is untouched. But among the Israelites, the story is different. Their doors are marked with lamb's blood, a sign of protection. Death passes over them, a moment remembered forever as Passover, the night of deliverance. In the cries that rise across Egypt, Pharaoh finally breaks. "Go!" he commands, his voice cracked with grief. "Leave my land, take your people, and serve your God." And so, under the stars of that long-awaited night, the children of Israel set out. They leave behind chains and whips, carrying with them unleavened bread, hurriedly prepared, and the hope of freedom. They march not as slaves, but as a people reborn. This is no ordinary escape. It is the defining moment of identity, a shift from bondage to nationhood, from despair to destiny. The Exodus is not only their story, it becomes a universal symbol of liberation. Wherever Jews would wander in centuries to come, they would recall this night. We were slaves in Egypt, and the Lord brought us out with a mighty hand. The God who once spoke to Abraham beneath the stars has now shown himself in the heart of an empire. He is not a distant deity of mountains and dreams, but a deliverer who bends history toward freedom. And as the Israelites march into the unknown wilderness, their journey as a people truly begins. The night is alive with chaos. Thousands upon thousands of Israelites hurry into the darkness, their footsteps pounding against the sand, their voices urgent with both fear and hope. Behind them, the fires of Egypt burn, and in the distance, the sound of chariots rattles like thunder. Pharaoh has changed his mind once more. His grief turned to fury, his pride unbroken. He sends his army to chase the fugitives down. The people panic. Before them lies the vast Red Sea, endless waters blocking their escape. Behind them, the greatest army in the world surges closer. Men cry out, women clutch their children. Fear spreads like wildfire. "Why did you bring us here to die?" they shout at Moses. Their voices tremble with despair, their newfound freedom already threatened. Moses raises his staff, his eyes fixed not on the sea or the soldiers, but on the heavens. The voice of God speaks again. "Lift up your staff, stretch out your hand over the sea, and divide it, that the children of Israel may go through on dry ground." Then the impossible happens. A mighty wind roars across the waters, churning waves into towering walls on either side. The seabed, once drowned, cracks open into dry earth. A path forms, lit by the moon, stretching into the heart of the sea. The Israelites step forward, their fear mingled with awe. Children peer at the walls of water, shimmering with fish darting in the depths, as though creation itself has bent to make way for them. Behind them, the Egyptians charge into the waters, their chariots clattering across the exposed seabed. But the miracle is not theirs to share. The sea turns against them, mud sucking at wheels, panic spreading through their ranks. In that instant, Moses stretches out his hand once more. The waters crash down with a deafening roar, swallowing Pharaoh's army in a surge of fury. When the dawn breaks, the sea is calm again, its waves lapping gently as though nothing had happened. On the far shore stand the Israelites, safe and free. Their fear is gone, replaced by something deeper, awe, reverence, and joy. And from their lips rises a song, the song of the sea. "The Lord is my strength and my song. Horse and rider he has thrown into the sea." The people dance, tambourines ringing in the hands of Miriam, Moses' sister. For the first time, a nation sings as one, their voices carrying across the wilderness. The crossing of the Red Sea becomes a memory that will never fade. It is more than escape. It is a declaration. No empire, no army, no sea can stand against the God who delivers. For Jews across the ages, this moment becomes the beating heart of faith, retold every year at Passover, sung in prayers, whispered in times of fear. He split the sea for us, and he will save us again. The journey, however, has only begun. The desert ahead is vast and unforgiving. Freedom, they will soon learn, is not only a gift but a challenge. They are no longer slaves, but neither are they yet a nation. Their greatest test still awaits, not in the waters of the sea, but in the fire of a mountain. The wilderness stretches wide, barren and silent, until the people arrive at the foot of a great mountain, Sinai. They camp there, thousands of tents scattered across the plain. Their journey paused. Freedom is no longer just about leaving Egypt. It is about discovering who they are meant to become. For without law, without purpose, freedom is chaos. And it is here, at Sinai, that destiny will descend in fire. Thunder rolls across the skies. Lightning splits the darkness. A thick cloud envelopes the mountain, trembling as though creation itself holds its breath. The people gather, trembling, their hearts pounding. The blast of a shofar grows louder and louder until it seems to pierce the soul. Then, from within the fire and smoke, the voice comes, not soft, not hidden, but thunderous, shaking the earth. I am the Lord your God, who brought you out of Egypt, out of the house of slavery. You shall have no other gods before me. The words echo, burning into memory. These are not the decrees of an earthly king, but commandments from the eternal. They shape a people not by sword or conquest, but by covenant, a sacred agreement between God and Israel. The 10 Commandments lay the foundation. Loyalty to God, sanctity of life, respect for family, justice, truth, and rest. But Sinai is not just about rules. It is about relationship. For the first time, a nation of former slaves hears that they are chosen, set apart to be a kingdom of priests and a holy nation. The covenant is not forced, it is offered. And the people, their voices united, respond with words that will define their identity. All that the Lord has spoken, we will do, and we will hear. The scene is overwhelming. Fire blazing, smoke billowing, the mountain trembling. Moses ascends into the thick cloud, stepping into mystery, disappearing into the summit where he will remain for 40 days. There, he receives not only the stone tablets but a vision of what it means to live as a holy people. Laws of justice, compassion, community, and worship. Sinai becomes the birthplace of Torah, the heart of Jewish life. And yet, even here, human frailty lingers. While Moses tarries on the mountain, doubt festers in the camp below. The people, afraid and impatient, build a golden calf, a symbol of false security. Their cries of worship rise not to heaven, but to an idol of their own making. When Moses descends and sees their betrayal, his grief is fierce. The stone tablets shatter against the rocks. Covenant, like freedom, is fragile, requiring faith to sustain it. Still, the story does not end in failure. Moses ascends again, pleading for mercy, and the covenant is renewed. New tablets are carved, forgiveness is granted, and the bond endures. From this struggle, a lesson emerges. The Jewish people are not perfect, but they are chosen to wrestle, to repent, to return again and again to the God who calls them his own. From Sinai onward, the identity of Israel is transformed. No longer just survivors of Egypt, they are now bearers of a divine mission. Every scroll, every prayer, every tradition flows back to this moment, when a mountain burned, and a people listened, and a covenant was written not only on stone, but upon their hearts. The camp breaks at Sinai, and the people move forward into the wilderness. The journey to the promised land should be short, but it stretches into 40 long years. This is no accident of geography. It is a shaping fire. The wilderness becomes their crucible, a place where a nation is formed not in ease, but in struggle. The desert is harsh. The sun burns during the day, the cold bites at night, and food is scarce. Complaints rise quickly from weary throats. Why did you bring us out here to die? In Egypt, we had bread and meat. Freedom, so recently won, feels fragile against hunger and thirst. And yet, every complaint becomes a chance for provision. When thirst grips the people, water flows from a rock. When hunger gnaws at their stomachs, bread falls from heaven. Manna, white as frost, gathered fresh each morning. It tastes like honey, but it comes with a lesson. Take only enough for each day and trust for tomorrow. Still, the people struggle. They long for certainty, for the stability of Egypt, even if it came with chains. The wilderness reveals their hearts, fearful, restless, doubting. Yet it also reveals God's patience, leading them with a pillar of cloud by day and a pillar of fire by night. Every step, though uncertain, is guided. At the edges of the camp, battles erupt. Amalekites strike without warning, testing the resolve of this newborn nation. In one scene, Moses raises his hands toward heaven, and as long as his arms are lifted, Israel prevails. When his strength falters, Aaron and Hur hold his arms high until victory is secured. The lesson is clear. Survival is not by might alone, but by faith sustained together. But the greatest test comes not from enemies outside, but from within. Again and again the people doubt. They rebel, question, and sometimes even dream of returning to slavery rather than facing the uncertainty of freedom. At Kadesh, when the land of Canaan lies just ahead, spies return with fearful reports. Giants in the land, fortified cities, impossible odds. Fear spreads like poison, and the people refuse to enter. Their lack of faith seals their fate. This generation will wander until it passes away, and only their children will inherit the promise. Yet even in this long season of wandering, moments of grace shine. The tabernacle, a portable sanctuary, is built in the heart of the camp. Its golden lampstands and sacred altar remind the people that the God who thundered at Sinai now dwells among them, even in their imperfection. Festivals are established, rhythms of worship that will shape Jewish identity for millennia. Passover, Shavuot, Sukkot, each one a reminder of deliverance, covenant, and dependence. The wilderness, harsh and unrelenting, becomes more than punishment. It is transformation. A generation that knew only slavery gives way to one raised in freedom, shaped by manna, guided by fire, tested by desert winds. They learn that freedom is not found in abundance, but in trust. When the 40 years finally draw to a close, the people stand once more at the edge of the promised land. The wilderness lies behind them, and a new horizon stretches ahead. They are no longer a wandering mass of ex-slaves. They are Israel, a people bound by covenant, ready to step into destiny. The long years of wandering draw to a close. The camp of Israel now stands at the plains of Moab, gazing across the Jordan River. Beyond it lies Canaan, the land promised to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. The dream that began under the stars with Abraham is now within reach. Yet the one who led them out of Egypt, who split the sea, who ascended Sinai, will not set foot there. Moses, aged and weathered, gathers the people for his final words. His voice carries not only authority but the tenderness of a shepherd who has walked with them through every trial. He recounts their journey, the miracles, the rebellions, the lessons learned in fire and sand. His speeches, preserved in the book of Deuteronomy, are more than farewell. They are a covenant renewed. Remember, he pleads, you were slaves in Egypt, and the Lord your God brought you out with a mighty hand. Keep his commandments, teach them to your children, bind them to your hearts. Choose life, that you and your descendants may live. These words are not bound to the moment. They echo across centuries, reminding every generation of Jews that memory and obedience are the lifeblood of their identity. Moses appoints Joshua as his successor, a leader who has proven himself in battle and in faith. Joshua will lead them into the land, but Moses' role is different, not to enter but to prepare. On Mount Nebo, he climbs alone, his eyes sweeping across the horizon. From the mountain's peak, he sees the land, the green valleys, the hills, the rivers. It is so close, yet for him it remains a vision only. There, on that mountain, Moses breathes his last. His grave is unmarked, hidden, a reminder that the story is never about one man, but about the people he served. Israel mourns, weeping for their leader, but the journey does not end in grief. Joshua rises, the mantle passed, the promise still alive. The closing of Moses' life marks a turning point. The people are no longer wanderers clinging to a leader. They are a nation, ready to claim their destiny. The Torah, given through Moses, becomes their inheritance, a treasure greater than land or power. Wherever they go, in times of triumph or exile, they will carry his words, his laws, his memory. And so chapter 2 ends with a threshold. Behind them lies Egypt, slavery, wilderness, and trial. Ahead lies Canaan, conquest, and the challenges of nationhood. But between those two lies the figure of Moses, the lawgiver, the prophet, the servant of God. whose farewell reminds them that freedom is not simply entering a land, but living as a people bound to covenant. As the Jordan glimmers in the sunlight and the camp readies to move forward, one truth stands firm. Empires rise and fall, leaders live and die, but the promise endures. The Jewish story marches on, carried not by kings or armies, but by a people bound to the words first spoken on Sinai. The Jordan River glistens under the morning sun, its currents swift and deep. On its eastern bank, the children of Israel wait, hearts pounding, eyes fixed on the land that has lived only in their dreams. This is the land sworn to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Now, under Joshua's command, they will cross from promise into possession. The river, however, is not their ally. It surges at flood stage, its waters defiant. But just as the sea once split before Moses, the Jordan will yield to Joshua. At the command of the Lord, priests carry the Ark of the Covenant into the water. As their feet touch the river's edge, the current halts. Waters pile up in a wall far upstream, and the riverbed lies dry. With awe and urgency, the people cross, the Ark at their center. A living reminder that the God who delivered them from Egypt now leads them into destiny. On the western bank, near Jericho, Joshua commands 12 stones to be taken from the riverbed and set as a memorial. When your children ask what these stones mean, he says, tell them the waters of the Jordan stopped before the Ark of the Covenant. Memory, once again, is marked in stone, a pattern that will sustain the Jewish people through every exile and return. But conquest is not only about rivers. It is about cities and battles. Jericho looms ahead, its walls high and unyielding. Yet God's strategy is unlike any known to generals. For 6 days, the Israelites march silently around the city, priests blowing trumpets of ram's horns. On the 7th day, they circle 7 times, the horns blast, and the people shout with one voice. The ground shakes, and Jericho's walls collapse. Victory comes not by sword, but by faith and obedience. The conquest spreads across the land. Kings rise against Israel, alliances form, battles rage. The book of Joshua records victories and struggles, tribes receiving their inheritance, boundaries drawn, land apportioned. Yet the story is not merely about military triumphs. It is about the fulfillment of promise. A people once enslaved now stand as free inheritors of a land flowing with milk and honey. But shadows remain. Not every city is conquered, not every enemy destroyed. The land is theirs, but their unity is fragile. Tribes settle into their territories, sometimes cooperating, often divided. Joshua, in his final speech, warns them, choose this day whom you will serve. As for me and my house, we will serve the Lord. His words echo through time, a call to faithfulness, a reminder that possession of the land depends not only on strength, but on covenant loyalty. When Joshua dies, the people bury him in his inheritance. A generation passes, one that knew the miracles of Egypt and Sinai. But with time, memory fades, and new struggles arise. The tribes, without a central leader, fall into cycles of faith and failure. They forget, they worship idols, they suffer at the hands of enemies, and then cry out for deliverance. God raises judges, warriors, prophets, leaders to rescue them. But the cycle repeats again and again. The conquest of Canaan marks both triumph and challenge. The promise is fulfilled, yet the task of remaining faithful is just beginning. The land is not just soil and stone. It is a test, a stage where the covenant must be lived out. The story of Israel now shifts from conquest to survival, from unity to division, from promise to the painful reality of human frailty. The land has been claimed, but the promise is fragile. Without Joshua, Israel has no single leader to guide them. The tribes scatter into their allotted territories, each tending to their own survival. At first, there is peace, but soon a cycle emerges, a pattern that will define the age of the judges. The people forget. Surrounded by Canaanite neighbors, they turn to foreign gods, bowing to Baal and Asherah, lured by idols and rituals. Their covenant with the God of Sinai fades into neglect. And as memory weakens, so does protection. Enemies rise, Moabites, Midianites, Philistines, and Israel falls into oppression. The people cry out in desperation, and God answers, raising up judges. Leaders not crowned kings, but deliverers empowered for a season. The book of Judges tells these stories, each one a glimpse into the struggle of a nation learning to live free. There is Othniel, the first judge, who wins early victories. Ehud, the left-handed warrior, who strikes down the Moabite king with cunning and courage. Deborah, a prophetess and leader, who summons Barak to battle and sings of victory when Sisera's army falls. Gideon, timid and uncertain, who tests God with fleece and lanterns, yet leads 300 men to rout an army of thousands. And Samson, the strong man, whose downfall through Delilah reveals that strength without faith leads only to ruin. But in every story, the cycle repeats. After deliverance comes peace. After peace comes forgetfulness. After forgetfulness comes idolatry, and then oppression returns. The refrain is haunting. In those days, there was no king in Israel. Everyone did what was right in his own eyes. It is a time of both heroism and chaos, a mirror of the human heart, brave, frail, and endlessly in need of redemption. Yet even in the darkest moments, seeds of hope are planted. Ruth, a Moabite widow, chooses loyalty to her Israelite mother-in-law Naomi, saying, "Your people shall be my people, and your God my God." Her faithfulness shines against the backdrop of disorder, and her lineage will one day bring forth a king. The era of the judges stretches for centuries, a season where the tribes are bound more by shared suffering than by unity. It is a time of learning, of stumbling, of being reminded that faith cannot be inherited without choice. Each generation must decide anew whether to serve the God of Sinai or bow to the idols of their neighbors. And as the cycle turns again and again, a yearning grows within Israel. The yearning for stability, for leadership, for a king who can unite the tribes and lead them as one nation. This yearning will soon shape their destiny, but it comes with a warning, for in seeking a king, they may gain unity but risk forgetting that their true king has always been the Lord. As the age of the judges wanes, the land groans under chaos. Enemies press on every side, and corruption seeps into the priesthood itself. In Shiloh, where the Ark of the Covenant rests, the priests Hophni and Phinehas exploit their position, turning holy service into greed. Yet in the same sanctuary, a new voice is being prepared, the voice of Samuel, a child dedicated to God before his birth. Samuel's story begins with a mother's prayer. Hannah, once barren, weeps in the temple, pleading for a son and vowing to dedicate him to the Lord. Her prayer is heard, and Samuel is born. From his earliest days, he grows up under the watch of Eli the priest. One night, as the lamp of God flickers in the temple, Samuel hears a voice calling his name. At first, he thinks it is Eli, but then he realizes it is the Lord. This moment marks the beginning of Samuel's prophetic mission, a turning point for Israel. As Samuel matures, his role becomes clear. He is the last of the judges, and the first of a new kind of leader, a prophet who bridges the old era with the dawning of kingship. He leads the people back to faith, calling them to repent and turn from idols. Under his guidance, the Israelites defeat the Philistines at Mizpah, a victory attributed not to military strength, but to God's intervention. Samuel sets up a stone and names it Ebenezer, saying, "Thus far the Lord has helped us." Yet even Samuel cannot halt the rising tide of discontent. The people grow restless. They look at the nations around them, strong and united under kings, and they long for the same. "Appoint for us a king to judge us like all the nations," they demand. Samuel is grieved, not only because they reject his leadership, but because in asking for a king, they are rejecting the kingship of God. The Lord speaks to Samuel. "They have not rejected you, but they have rejected me from being king over them." Samuel warns the people of what kingship will bring: taxation, conscription, servitude, and the risk of corruption. But the cry persists, "Give us a king." Reluctantly, Samuel obeys. He anoints Saul, a man tall and strong, a warrior who seems fit to lead. At first, Saul brings unity and victory, rallying Israel against their enemies. Yet even in this choice lies a shadow. For human kings, unlike the divine king, will falter. Samuel's story embodies both faith and tension. He reminds the people of their covenant, but he also inaugurates a new chapter, the monarchy. Israel will no longer be a loose confederation of tribes. They will be a kingdom, but in gaining a throne, they risk losing sight of the God who delivered them from Egypt and gave them the land. The cry for a king is both a longing for stability and a test of faith. In Samuel's time, Israel stands at a crossroads, between judges and kings, between covenant loyalty and the temptations of worldly power. What follows will be a story of triumph and tragedy, of great kings and broken ones, a story that shapes the destiny of Israel for generations. At first, Saul seems like the answer to Israel's cry. He is tall, commanding, and courageous, everything a people weary of disunity could want in a leader. When the Ammonites threaten the town of Jabesh-Gilead, Saul rallies the tribes with fiery resolve, leading them to victory. His triumph unites the people, and Samuel anoints him publicly as Israel's first king. For a moment, hope burns bright. Israel has entered a new age. But kingship is a dangerous gift. Power, once given, reveals character. Saul begins humbly, hiding among the baggage at his coronation, reluctant to claim the crown. Yet soon cracks emerge. When faced with Philistine armies, Saul grows impatient, waiting for Samuel to offer sacrifice. Instead of trusting God's timing, he takes matters into his own hands. The act seems small, but in it lies the seed of downfall. A king who places his will above God's command. Again, Saul is tested. Sent against the Amalekites, he is told to devote them and their possessions fully to destruction, a judgment rooted in their unprovoked attacks on Israel. But Saul spares their king and keeps the choicest livestock, cloaking disobedience in excuses. Samuel's rebuke is sharp and unforgettable. To obey is better than sacrifice, and to listen than the fat of rams. Because you have rejected the word of the Lord, he has rejected you as king. From this moment, Saul's reign unravels. Though he still wears the crown, the Spirit of God departs from him, and a tormenting spirit takes its place. His moods darken, paranoia grows, whispers of a new chosen one spread. A shepherd boy named David, skilled with a harp and anointed by Samuel in secret. David's music soothes Saul's troubled spirit, but his victories on the battlefield spark jealousy. When David slays the Philistine giant Goliath with nothing but a sling and a stone, the people sing, "Saul has slain his thousands, and David his tens of thousands." The chorus fuels Saul's rage. What follows is a tragic spiral. Saul, once the unifier of Israel, becomes consumed with envy and fear. He hurls spears at David, hunts him through wilderness and caves, and even turns against his own son Jonathan, who loves David as a brother. His kingdom becomes fractured by his obsession. The final act of Saul's life comes in darkness. Desperate for guidance before battle, abandoned by God's silence, he turns to a forbidden medium, the Witch of Endor, seeking Samuel's spirit. The prophet's ghostly voice offers no comfort, only doom. The kingdom will fall, and Saul with it. On the battlefield against the Philistines, Saul's sons fall, and he himself is struck. Refusing capture, he falls on his own sword. The man who began with promise dies in despair, his legacy marred by disobedience and fear. Saul's story is not merely tragedy. It is warning. Leadership without obedience leads to ruin. A king without trust in God becomes a burden to his people. Yet even in Saul's fall, the path opens for another, David, the shepherd warrior, whose heart will redefine kingship. The age of kings has begun, not with glory, but with a painful reminder. Crowns may shine, but only covenant faithfulness endures. From the pastures of Bethlehem to the throne of Israel, David's journey is one of the most iconic in history. He begins as the youngest son of Jesse, overlooked even by his own family. Yet when Samuel comes to anoint the future king, it is not the tall or the strong who are chosen, but the boy tending sheep. Man looks on the outward appearance, Samuel declares, but the Lord looks on the heart, and in David's heart burns a devotion that will shape Israel's destiny. David's rise begins with courage. When the Philistine giant Goliath mocks Israel, David refuses to cower. Armed only with a sling, he strikes the giant down, showing that faith can triumph over fear. His victory catapults him into fame, yet it also sparks the jealousy of Saul. For years, David lives as a fugitive, hiding in caves, fleeing across deserts, even seeking refuge among the Philistines themselves. But in his exile, he learns patience, humility, and reliance on God. Twice, David has the chance to kill Saul, his pursuer. Twice, he spares him. "I will not lift my hand against the Lord's anointed," David insists. These moments reveal his restraint, a king in waiting who refuses to seize power by force. Instead, he entrusts his future to God. When Saul's life ends in defeat, David laments, not rejoices. His elegy over Saul and Jonathan is raw with grief. "How the mighty have fallen." It is a testament to David's loyalty and humanity, even toward a rival who sought his life. Crowned king in Hebron, David first rules over Judah, and later, after years of conflict, unites all 12 tribes. His reign marks a turning point. For the first time, Israel stands as a true kingdom, strong and united. David captures Jerusalem, making it his capital, and brings the Ark of the Covenant into the city with songs and dancing. In Jerusalem, political and spiritual power converge, laying the foundation for a dynasty that will echo through the ages. But David's greatness is not in conquest alone. He is a poet, a psalmist, a man whose prayers will give voice to centuries of Jewish faith. His psalms cry out in joy, sorrow, repentance, and trust. "The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want." Through his words, David teaches that kingship is not about glory, but about dependence on God. Yet David is not without flaws. His sin with Bathsheba, taking another man's wife and orchestrating her husband's death, casts a shadow over his reign. When the prophet Nathan confronts him with the parable of the stolen lamb, David's heart breaks in repentance. "I have sinned against the Lord." Unlike Saul, who justified his actions, David confesses and turns back. His legacy is not perfection, but a heart that seeks God even in failure. Toward the end of his reign, turmoil erupts within his own family. Rebellion, betrayal, grief. Yet through it all, the covenant remains. God promises David that his dynasty will endure, that one of his descendants will sit on the throne forever. This promise will become the heartbeat of Jewish hope, a vision of a messianic future where justice and peace will reign. David dies in Jerusalem, remembered not only as a warrior and king, but as a man after God's own heart. His reign cements Israel's identity, setting the stage for a golden age under his son Solomon. From shepherd to sovereign, from psalmist to sinner, David embodies the paradox of kingship. Flawed humanity and divine calling intertwined. His story reminds us that true greatness is not the absence of failure, but the presence of faith and repentance. The throne of Israel now passes to Solomon, son of David and Bathsheba. His ascent is not without struggle. Rival brothers vie for power, and whispers of rebellion threaten the fragile succession. Yet once Solomon secures the crown, his reign ushers in a new era, one remembered as Israel's golden age. Unlike his father, who was a warrior, Solomon is a man of peace and wisdom. Early in his reign, he travels to Gibeon to offer sacrifices. There, in a dream, the Lord appears and offers him a gift. "Ask what I shall give you." Solomon does not ask for riches or long life or the death of his enemies. Instead, he asks for wisdom, an understanding heart to judge your people, that I may discern between good and evil. This request pleases God, who grants him wisdom unlike any before, and adds wealth and honor besides. Solomon's wisdom becomes legendary. 2 women come before him, both claiming to be the mother of a child. In a bold test, Solomon orders the baby cut in 2, giving half to each woman. One cries out to spare the child, revealing her true motherhood. The people marvel. The wisdom of God is in him to administer justice. From this story onward, Solomon's name is forever linked with discernment and fairness. But his greatest legacy is not judgment. It is the temple. David longed to build a house for the Ark of the Covenant, but God declared the task would belong to his son. Solomon takes up the charge with zeal. Craftsmen from across the region are summoned. Cedar wood is brought from Lebanon. Gold and bronze are gathered in abundance. For 7 years, laborers toil, until at last the temple rises on Mount Moriah in Jerusalem, a place where heaven and earth meet. The dedication of the temple is a moment of awe. Priests carry the ark into the Holy of Holies, and when they set it beneath the wings of the cherubim, a cloud fills the sanctuary. The glory of the Lord descends so powerfully that the priests cannot stand to minister. Solomon lifts his hands and prays. Will God indeed dwell on the earth? Behold, heaven and the highest heaven cannot contain you. How much less this house that I have built? Yet may your eyes be open toward this temple night and day, the place of which you said, My name shall be there. For the people of Israel, the temple becomes the heartbeat of faith. It is the dwelling place of God's presence, the center of sacrifice and worship, the sign that the covenant has taken root in stone and ritual. Pilgrims will stream to it for generations, offering prayers and sacrifices, remembering that the God of Sinai now dwells in their midst. Solomon's reign is marked by prosperity. Trade flourishes, alliances expand, and Israel's influence stretches across the known world. Wealth pours into Jerusalem, making it a jewel of splendor. The Queen of Sheba herself travels across deserts to test Solomon with riddles, leaving in awe of his wisdom and riches. And yet, even in this golden age, shadows stir. Solomon's heart, once wholly devoted, begins to waver. Foreign wives bring foreign gods, and altars rise to idols within the very land consecrated to the Lord. His wisdom is unmatched, but his heart is divided. The seeds of division are sown, and they will bear bitter fruit in generations to come. Still, the image of Solomon dedicating the temple endures. A king kneeling, a people rejoicing, a cloud of glory filling the sanctuary. For this moment, Israel stands at the height of its unity and splendor, the covenant shining bright. It is the pinnacle before the fractures that will follow. The reign of Solomon sparkles like gold in the annals of Israel's history. Wealth flows into Jerusalem from every direction, and its markets brim with spices, precious stones, and exotic goods brought by caravans and ships. His navy sails from Ezion-Geber, his caravans travel the trade routes of Arabia, and his alliances stretch to Egypt and beyond. For the first time, Israel is not merely a people surviving, it is a kingdom thriving, admired by the nations. The Queen of Sheba's visit captures the height of Solomon's fame. She journeys with a great caravan of camels bearing spices, gold, and jewels, drawn by stories of the king's wisdom. When she sees his palace, the temple, his servants, and his wealth, she is overwhelmed. The half was not told me. Your wisdom and prosperity surpass the report that I heard. Her gifts and praise testify to Israel's prestige. Under Solomon, Jerusalem becomes a beacon of power and knowledge. Solomon's wisdom is not confined to judgment alone. He is a poet and philosopher, composing thousands of proverbs and songs. His reflections on love, nature, and the human heart echo across centuries, weaving into the sacred writings of Israel. His reign becomes synonymous with insight and learning, a model for rulers who long for both prosperity and discernment. Yet the splendor carries a cost. The vast building projects, including the temple and Solomon's palace, require heavy labor. To maintain his court and fund his ventures, Solomon imposes high taxes and conscripts workers from across Israel. For many, the golden age begins to feel like a burden, the brilliance of the crown casting shadows over daily life. And in Solomon's heart, cracks begin to widen. His marriages to foreign princesses, over 700 wives and 300 concubines, are not merely personal but political, designed to secure alliances. Yet with them come altars to foreign gods. Ashtoreth of the Sidonians, Milcom of the Ammonites, Chemosh of Moab. The king who built the temple to honor the one true God now permits shrines to idols on the hills surrounding Jerusalem. His devotion, once pure, grows divided. The Lord's anger stirs. Twice God appears to Solomon, warning him, but the warnings go unheeded. The covenant had promised blessing for faithfulness and discipline for disobedience. And so a judgment is pronounced. The kingdom will be torn away after Solomon's death, divided among his descendants. Even as decline sets in, Solomon's wisdom recognizes the futility of earthly pursuits. In his later years, reflections attributed to him in Ecclesiastes ring with weary honesty. Vanity of vanities, all is vanity. What does man gain by all the toil at which he toils under the sun? The king who possessed everything acknowledges that wealth and pleasure cannot satisfy the soul. Only reverence for God endures. When Solomon dies after 40 years of reign, he leaves behind both glory and fracture. He built the temple, raised Israel to unmatched heights, and became a legend of wisdom. Yet his divided heart planted seeds of division that will soon split the kingdom in two. The story of Solomon is both triumph and warning. The heights of prosperity, the beauty of wisdom, but also the peril of compromise. His reign ends not with destruction, but with a sense of unfinished promise. The golden age glitters, but its shine is fading, and the road ahead will be marked not by unity, but by fracture. The death of Solomon marks the end of Israel's golden age. What follows is not unity but fracture, a splitting of the nation that will echo for centuries. The seeds of division, sown in heavy taxation and forced labor, now bear bitter fruit. Solomon's son Rehoboam inherits the throne. When the people gather at Shechem to crown him, they come not only with loyalty but with a plea. Your father made our yoke heavy. Lighten the harsh labor and taxes, and we will serve you. It is a moment of decision, a chance to heal the growing rift between king and people. The elders advise Rehoboam wisely. Show kindness, ease their burden, and they will follow him faithfully. But the young advisors, eager for power, urge arrogance. Say to them, my little finger is thicker than my father's waist. My father disciplined you with whips. I will discipline you with scorpions. Rehoboam chooses pride over compassion. His harsh reply sparks rebellion. The 10 northern tribes, weary of Jerusalem's dominance, reject the house of David. They crown Jeroboam as their king, and the kingdom of Israel splits in two. To the south, Judah and Benjamin remain loyal to David's line, forming the kingdom of Judah with Jerusalem as its capital. To the north, the kingdom of Israel establishes its own centers of power. Jeroboam fears that if his people continue traveling to Jerusalem to worship, their loyalty will return to Rehoboam. So he erects golden calves at Bethel and Dan, declaring, here are your gods, O Israel, who brought you up out of Egypt. These shrines, meant to secure loyalty, instead lead the people deeper into idolatry, drawing them away from the covenant. The once united nation of Israel is now two kingdoms, Judah in the south, ruled by the descendants of David, and Israel in the north, ruled by a succession of rival dynasties. Both will experience moments of strength and seasons of weakness, but division makes them vulnerable to corruption within and enemies without. Prophets rise to confront kings, calling them back to the covenant. Voices like Elijah and Elisha thunder in the north, challenging idolatry and injustice. In Judah, prophets like Isaiah and Micah will one day speak of both judgment and hope. Yet the people often ignore their warnings. The division of the kingdom is more than political. It is spiritual. It reflects the divided heart of Solomon, magnified in his heirs. What began as a golden age now fractures into two struggling nations, each wrestling with faithfulness and failure. From this point forward, the story of Israel will not be of unity and prosperity, but of survival amid decline. The divided kingdoms stand as a lesson. Power built on pride and oppression cannot endure. The promise to David's line remains, but it will be tested through centuries of turmoil. The united kingdom is gone, and the shadow of exile begins to lengthen. With the kingdom divided, Israel's heart drifts further from the covenant. Kings rise and fall in the north, most of them leading their people deeper into idolatry. Shrines to Baal and Asherah spread across the land, and injustice festers in the courts. In Judah, David's line still sits on the throne, but even there, loyalty to God is uneven. Amid this decline, a new kind of leader steps forward. Not kings, but prophets, fiery voices who speak truth to power. Foremost among them is Elijah the Tishbite, a man whose very name means, "My God is the Lord." He appears suddenly, confronting King Ahab of Israel and his queen Jezebel, who have made Baal worship the religion of the royal court. With fearless words, Elijah declares a drought. "There shall be neither dew nor rain these years, except by my word." The skies close, and famine grips the land. For years, Elijah lives in obscurity, fed by ravens at a brook, then sustained by the generosity of a widow in Zarephath. Even in scarcity, the God of Israel provides, multiplying oil and flour, raising the widow's son from death. These miracles reveal that faithfulness is not bound to palaces but can dwell in humble homes. But Elijah's greatest moment comes atop Mount Carmel. There, before the gathered people and 450 prophets of Baal, he issues a challenge. "How long will you waver between two opinions? If the Lord is God, follow him. But if Baal, follow him." 2 altars are built, 2 sacrifices prepared. The prophets of Baal cry out all day, cutting themselves, dancing, begging their God to answer with fire, but the skies remain silent. Then Elijah repairs the altar of the Lord, drenches the sacrifice with water, and prays simply, "Answer me, O Lord, that this people may know that you are God." Fire falls from heaven, consuming the sacrifice, the wood, the stones, even the water in the trench. The people fall on their faces. "The Lord, He is God. The Lord, He is God." The prophets of Baal are defeated, and the drought ends with rain from heaven. It is a moment of triumph. Yet Elijah soon flees into the wilderness, weary and afraid. On Mount Horeb, he encounters God not in wind, earthquake, or fire, but in a gentle whisper. The lesson is clear. Divine power is not always found in spectacle, but in quiet presence. Elijah's mission passes to Elisha, his disciple, who receives a double portion of his spirit. Elisha performs miracles of healing, provision, and even resurrection, continuing the prophetic witness. Together, Elijah and Elisha embody a new dimension of leadership, calling the people back to covenant when kings fail to do so. In Judah, prophets also rise. Isaiah, centuries later, will thunder against injustice, declaring that God desires righteousness, not empty sacrifices. Micah will remind the people of what the Lord requires: to act justly, to love mercy, and to walk humbly with your God. These voices carry both judgment and hope, warning of exile yet promising restoration. The age of prophets becomes Israel's conscience. They are poets and preachers, comforters and challengers, standing against idolatry and corruption. Their words, often ignored in their own time, will echo across millennia, shaping not only Judaism but faith traditions far beyond. But for now, their cries fall upon hardened hearts. The people may tremble at miracles, but their loyalty wavers. Kings continue to compromise, altars to foreign gods continue to rise, and injustice continues to spread. The prophets warn that such unfaithfulness cannot stand forever. If the people do not return to the covenant, judgment will come, and with it, exile. The story of Elijah and the prophets is a reminder. Even in times of corruption, voices of truth rise. They may be persecuted, lonely, or ignored, but their witness burns like fire, keeping the covenant alive in a darkening age. The kingdom of Israel in the north never finds lasting stability. Kings rise through bloodshed and fall through betrayal. Dynasties flicker like candle flames in the wind. Some reign briefly, others for decades, but nearly all walk the same path, turning the people further away from the covenant. The golden calves remain at Bethel and Dan, and with them, the memory of unity and faithfulness fades. Prophets plead, warn, and cry out. Amos, a shepherd from Judah, crosses the border to speak judgment against Israel's injustice. "Hear this, you who trample on the needy and bring the poor of the land to an end. Let justice roll down like waters, and righteousness like an ever-flowing stream." Hosea, commanded by God to marry an unfaithful wife, becomes a living parable of Israel's infidelity. A people who chase after idols yet are still loved with relentless mercy. But the kings and people, hardened in their ways, ignore the call. Meanwhile, a storm gathers on the horizon. The Assyrian Empire, fierce and relentless, expands westward. Its armies are unmatched, its reputation for cruelty feared across the ancient world. One by one, neighboring nations fall before its power. Israel, divided within and defiant against warnings, becomes its next target. In 722 BCE, the Assyrian king Shalmaneser V, and later Sargon II, lay siege to Samaria, the northern capital. For 3 long years, the city endures hunger, fear, and despair. At last, the walls collapse. The kingdom of Israel is no more. As people are carried away into exile, scattered across the vast Assyrian lands. Foreign peoples are brought in to replace them, mingling in the land until the identity of the northern tribes fades into history. They become known as the lost tribes of Israel, their fate one of the great mysteries of Jewish memory. The fall of Israel is not merely political, it is theological. The prophets had warned that idolatry, injustice, and covenant unfaithfulness would lead to destruction. Now the warnings prove true. The land once flowing with milk and honey lies under foreign rule. The kingdom that once shone in Solomon's glory is shattered. Yet even in judgment, a thread of hope remains. Hosea speaks of God's enduring love. How can I give you up, O Ephraim? How can I hand you over, O Israel? My heart recoils within me. My compassion grows warm and tender. The fall of Israel is a tragedy, but not the end of the story. In Judah, to the south, the line of David still stands. Jerusalem remains, and the temple still gleams on Mount Zion. But Judah, too, walks a perilous path. Some kings, like Hezekiah and Josiah, will lead reforms and return the people to God. Others will follow the same mistakes that doomed the north. For now, Judah survives, but the shadow of Assyria, and later Babylon, looms large. The fall of the northern kingdom is a warning written in history. Unfaithfulness brings ruin, and nations that forsake justice cannot endure. For the Jewish story, it is the first great exile, the first tearing away from the land promised to Abraham. It is a loss remembered with sorrow, yet also with determination, for the covenant is not erased, only tested. The story now turns south, where Judah must decide whether to heed the lessons of her fallen sister or follow her into destruction. With the northern kingdom of Israel destroyed by Assyria, the eyes of the ancient world turn southward to Judah. Jerusalem still stands, the temple still gleams, and the descendants of David still sit upon the throne. But Judah is not untouched by danger. The same storm that swallowed Israel now threatens to consume her as well. The Assyrian armies sweep across the region, their chariots rolling like thunder, their soldiers feared for brutality and strength. Cities across Judah fall one by one, their inhabitants carried into exile. The walls of Jerusalem tremble as the Assyrian king Sennacherib surrounds the city with overwhelming force. To many, it seems the end has come. In this moment of crisis, King Hezekiah rises as a leader of rare faith. Unlike many of his predecessors, he has devoted himself to restoring the covenant. He removes idols from the land, tears down altars to foreign gods, and calls the people back to worship the Lord in the temple. His heart, unlike Solomon's in his later years, is undivided. But his devotion will now be tested. Sennacherib's messengers mock the people on the walls of Jerusalem, shouting in their own tongue so all can understand, "Do not let Hezekiah deceive you. No god of any nation has delivered them from the king of Assyria. Why should your God deliver you?" Fear ripples through the city. To resist Assyria seems impossible. Hezekiah does what no king of Israel or Judah had done so fully before. He turns not to foreign alliances, not to wealth, not to military strength, but to prayer. He spreads Sennacherib's threatening letter before the Lord in the temple and cries out, "O Lord, God of Israel, enthroned above the cherubim, you alone are God over all the kingdoms of the earth. Incline your ear, O Lord, and hear. Save us, that all the kingdoms of the earth may know that you alone are God." The prophet Isaiah, a towering figure in Judah at this time, brings God's answer. The Assyrian king will not enter this city. By the way that he came, by the same he shall return, for I will defend this city to save it, for my own sake and for the sake of my servant David. That very night, the Assyrian army suffers a mysterious and devastating blow. Scripture records that an angel of the Lord struck down 185,000 soldiers. When morning dawns, Sennacherib withdraws in humiliation, and Jerusalem is spared. The city rejoices, not in its own strength, but in the deliverance of its God. Hezekiah's reign becomes a moment of hope, proof that trust in God can overcome even the mightiest empire. Yet the victory does not erase the nation's deeper struggles. Prosperity tempts them, injustice creeps back in, and idolatry lurks in the shadows. Prophets like Isaiah and Micah continue to warn that unless Judah clings to righteousness, she too will face judgment. For now, Judah stands. The storm has passed, and Jerusalem remains unbroken. But the warning is clear: survival is not guaranteed. The same God who defends the city will also discipline his people if they stray. The exile of the north hangs like a shadow over the south, reminding them of what can happen when faith falters. The story of Hezekiah and the Assyrian siege is one of faith against fear, trust against terror. It is a glimpse of what Judah could be if she remained steadfast. But history will show that the lessons of this generation will not always be remembered by the next. After Hezekiah, Judah wavers once more. Some kings follow the Lord, others plunge the nation back into idolatry. The people grow restless, the covenant neglected, and the temple itself falls into disrepair. It is into this atmosphere of decline that a young boy named Josiah ascends the throne. He is only 8 years old when crowned, too young to carry the burdens of a kingdom, yet his reign will become one of the most remarkable in Judah's history. As Josiah grows, his heart turns toward the God of David. In his teenage years, he begins to purge Judah of idolatry, tearing down altars to Baal, smashing carved images, and cleansing the land of false worship. Unlike kings before him, who often mixed devotion with compromise, Josiah is determined to restore purity to Judah's faith. The turning point comes during repairs to the temple. Amid the rubble and neglect, priests discover an ancient scroll, the Book of the Law, likely Deuteronomy or parts of the Torah long forgotten. When the words are read aloud to Josiah, he rends his garments in grief. For the first time in generations, the full covenant is heard again, its blessings and its curses ringing with power. The king is shaken. Great is the wrath of the Lord that is kindled against us, because our fathers have not obeyed the words of this book. Unlike many rulers who might have dismissed the warning, Josiah humbles himself. He gathers the people of Judah, great and small, and has the book read publicly. Standing before them, he renews the covenant, pledging himself and his kingdom to follow the Lord with all their heart and soul. Josiah's reforms are sweeping. He orders the destruction of high places where idols were worshipped, even in the territories once belonging to the northern kingdom. He restores proper worship in the temple, revives the Passover festival with a grandeur not seen since the days of Samuel, and reestablishes the people's identity as the covenant nation. Under his leadership, Judah briefly experiences a spiritual revival, a glimpse of what could have been if faithfulness had been consistent throughout its history. Yet the shadow of judgment lingers. The prophetess Huldah, consulted about the rediscovered scroll, delivers a sobering message. Judah has gone too far in its unfaithfulness. Though Josiah's humility and reforms delay disaster, they cannot erase the sins of generations. The exile will still come. Josiah himself will be spared from seeing it, but his people cannot escape the consequences forever. In the end, Josiah's reign ends tragically. At the age of 39, he marches out to confront Pharaoh Necho of Egypt at Megiddo. Despite warnings, he insists on the battle and is fatally wounded. His death plunges Judah into mourning. A righteous king cut down too soon, leaving behind a nation teetering once again on the edge of decline. Josiah's story is one of rediscovery and renewal, a reminder of the power of God's word to awaken hearts and transform nations. Yet it is also a warning. Revival, if not carried forward, fades quickly. After Josiah, weaker kings will undo his reforms, corruption will return, and the Babylonians will soon rise to finish what Assyria began. For a moment, however, Judah tasted what it meant to return fully to the covenant. Josiah's reign is remembered as a light in the darkness, proof that even in the final hours of a nation's decline, faithfulness still matters. After Josiah's death, Judah begins to unravel. His sons take the throne one after another, but none inherit his devotion or strength. The nation becomes entangled in the struggles of great empires, Egypt to the south, Babylon to the east. Judah is no longer a strong kingdom but a pawn in the hands of powers far greater than itself. The Babylonian Empire, under King Nebuchadnezzar, rises with unstoppable force. Egypt is defeated, and soon Babylon's shadow stretches over Judah. At first, Jerusalem submits, paying tribute to avoid destruction. But rebellion brews in the hearts of Judah's kings, fueled by false prophets who promise victory without repentance. The prophet Jeremiah stands almost alone in declaring the truth. Babylon's conquest is not a political accident, but divine judgment. Do not trust in deceptive words, saying, "This is the temple of the Lord. If you truly amend your ways and your deeds, then I will let you dwell in this place." But his warnings are mocked, and his tears for his people go unheeded. The first wave of conquest comes in 605 BCE. Nebuchadnezzar besieges Jerusalem, taking treasures from the temple and carrying away the first exiles, including young men of promise like Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. These captives will serve in Babylon, witnesses to faith in a foreign land. But Judah remains, clinging to the hope that rebellion might still save them. Years later, in 597 BCE, a second rebellion brings harsher punishment. More treasures are stripped from the temple, and thousands more are led away into exile, including the prophet Ezekiel. Yet Jerusalem still stands, its leaders stubbornly resisting the call to humility. Finally, in 586 BCE, Judah's defiance meets its end. Nebuchadnezzar returns with fury, laying siege to Jerusalem once more. The city suffers famine, despair, and betrayal. Mothers weep as food runs out, soldiers weaken, and walls crumble. After months of resistance, Babylon breaches the city. The temple, once the symbol of God's dwelling among his people, is set ablaze. Its golden vessels are carried away, its stones toppled. The walls of Jerusalem are torn down, and the people are led in chains to Babylon. The unimaginable has happened. The covenant nation, chosen to be a light to the world, lies in ruins. The land promised to Abraham is lost, the Davidic throne overturned, and the temple destroyed. To the people of Judah, it feels as though God himself has abandoned them. And yet, amid the ashes, the prophets speak of purpose. Jeremiah, though imprisoned and despised, delivers God's word of hope. "For I know the plans I have for you, plans for welfare and not for evil, to give you a future and a hope." Ezekiel, by the rivers of Babylon, envisions dry bones rising, a promise that Israel will live again. The exile is not the end, but a refining fire. The fall of Jerusalem is the darkest chapter yet in the Jewish story. The breaking of a nation, the silence of the temple, the sorrow of a people far from home. But within the grief lies a truth that will sustain them. Though the city may fall and the people may scatter, the covenant endures. God is not confined to a building or a land. Even in Babylon, he will be with them. The people of Judah, torn from their homeland, are marched eastward across deserts and rivers until they reach the sprawling heart of the Babylonian Empire. Towering walls, ziggurats that pierce the sky, and the famed Hanging Gardens stand in stark contrast to the ruins of Jerusalem left behind. Here, by the rivers of Babylon, the exiles sit and weep, remembering Zion. Their harps hang unused on the trees, for how can they sing the Lord's song in a foreign land? Exile is more than physical displacement. It is a spiritual crisis. The temple, the place where God's presence dwelt, lies in ashes. The Davidic throne, once a symbol of divine promise, has fallen. The land, flowing with milk and honey, is occupied by foreign powers. Everything that gave Judah its identity seems lost. And yet, in Babylon, a new form of resilience begins to take shape. Without the temple, the people turn to the Torah. Worship shifts from sacrifice to study, from ritual to remembrance. Gatherings in homes and community spaces, the beginnings of what will one day become synagogues, keep the covenant alive. Priests, scribes, and prophets ensure that memory is not erased. In exile, Judaism transforms from a religion tied to a single place to a faith that can survive anywhere. Among the exiles, figures like Daniel embody faith under pressure. Taken as a youth into the Babylonian court, Daniel refuses to defile himself with the king's food, choosing fidelity to God even in small things. When commanded to worship an idol, he and his companions, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, refuse. Cast into a fiery furnace, they emerge unharmed, a testament to the God who walks with his people even in the flames. Later, Daniel himself is thrown into a den of lions for praying to God rather than bowing to the king. Yet the lions' mouths are shut, and Daniel's deliverance becomes a beacon of hope for all exiles. Meanwhile, prophets like Ezekiel speak visions of restoration. By the Chebar Canal, Ezekiel sees the glory of God not bound to Jerusalem but appearing even in Babylon. He proclaims that God has not abandoned his people. His presence travels with them. In visions, he sees dry bones rising, flesh returning, and life breathed anew, a symbol of Israel restored after death-like exile. Exile also sharpens identity. Surrounded by Babylonian gods and customs, the Jews cling fiercely to their distinctiveness. Sabbath observance, dietary laws, and covenant traditions become lifelines. They refuse to be absorbed, holding fast to the promise given to Abraham, even when all evidence seems lost. Though many grieve as if the story has ended, the exile becomes a crucible. In Babylon, the Jewish people learn that their faith is not bound to land or temple but to the God who is everywhere. The covenant is not shattered but carried, etched into their hearts, surviving foreign domination, distance, and despair. Exile, then, is both tragedy and transformation. The people of Judah lose their home but discover that their God cannot be taken from them. In the shadow of Babylon's towers, a faith capable of enduring centuries of wandering and dispersion is born. The Babylonian exile, once thought permanent, takes a surprising turn through the rise of a new empire. In 539 BCE, Cyrus the Great of Persia marches into Babylon, and the once mighty city falls without a fight. Unlike the harsh rule of the Assyrians and Babylonians, the Persians adopt a different approach: tolerance. Cyrus allows exiled peoples to return to their homelands and worship their own gods. For the Jews, this decree is nothing less than miraculous. The Book of Ezra records Cyrus's proclamation: "The Lord, the God of heaven, has given me all the kingdoms of the earth, and he has charged me to build him a house at Jerusalem. Whoever is among you of all his people, may his God be with him, and let him go up to Jerusalem." After decades in exile, the door to return swings open. Led by Zerubbabel, a descendant of David, and Joshua the high priest, the first wave of exiles sets out for the long journey home. The road back to Jerusalem is not easy. The city they find is a shell of its former self. Walls broken, gates burned, and the temple reduced to rubble. Poverty and hardship await them, yet their hearts burn with determination. They have not come back to comfort. They have come back to rebuild. The first task is the altar. Before walls or houses, before even the temple itself, they restore the altar of sacrifice. Morning and evening offerings resume, a sign that worship is at the center of their return. Soon after, they lay the foundation for the second temple. At the dedication, older exiles who remember Solomon's glorious temple weep aloud, while younger voices shout with joy. The sound of mourning and celebration mingles, capturing the bittersweet reality of restoration. The new temple will never match the splendor of the old, but it is a symbol that God's presence has not departed. Opposition arises. Neighboring peoples resist the rebuilding, sending accusations to Persian authorities and stalling progress. For years, the work halts, the foundation lying exposed, a painful reminder of unfinished hope. Yet prophets Haggai and Zechariah rise to stir the people's courage. "Be strong, all you people of the land," declares the Lord. "Work, for I am with you." Encouraged, they resume, and the temple is finally completed in 516 BCE, 70 years after the first destruction. Later, additional groups return under leaders like Ezra and Nehemiah. Ezra renews devotion to the Torah, teaching the people once more the ways of the covenant. Nehemiah, cupbearer to the Persian king, receives permission to rebuild Jerusalem's walls. Against ridicule and threat, the walls rise, and the city once again has strength and identity. With the Torah read publicly, the people weep and rejoice, affirming their place as the covenant community. The return under Persia is not a full restoration of Israel's former glory. The Davidic throne is gone, foreign powers still rule, and the temple, though rebuilt, lacks the grandeur of Solomon's. Yet the return is a testimony to resilience. Exile did not destroy the Jewish people. It refined them. The covenant survived captivity, and now it is renewed on the soil of their ancestors. For the Jews, this chapter is both an ending and a beginning. The exile has ended, but the age of foreign rule has begun. Persia today, Greece tomorrow, Rome in centuries to come. Empires will rise and fall, but the Jewish people endure. Their story is no longer just about land and kings, but about faith that outlasts power. The return from exile brought hope, but it did not bring independence. Judah now lives under the shadow of empires. First Persia rules. Then, in the 4th century BCE, a new power sweeps across the world with astonishing speed: Greece, under the leadership of Alexander the Great. Alexander's conquests stretch from Greece to Egypt, from the shores of the Mediterranean to the plains of India. His victories leave more than military dominance. They spread a new way of life: Hellenism. Greek language, art, philosophy, and religion pour into every conquered land. Cities are refounded with Greek culture at their heart, and gymnasiums, theaters, and temples rise across the region. For the Jews, Hellenism is both opportunity and danger. On one hand, Greek language and culture offer access to new ideas, trade, and prestige. On the other, it threatens their identity, tempting them to abandon the covenant for the ways of the surrounding world. To some, adopting Greek customs seems harmless. To others, it feels like betrayal. A deep divide grows between Jews who embrace Hellenism and those who resist it. After Alexander's death, his empire splinters into rival kingdoms. Judah falls under the rule of the Ptolemies in Egypt, and later the Seleucids in Syria. At times, they enjoy relative peace, but under Seleucid king Antiochus IV Epiphanes, pressure to conform intensifies. Antiochus seeks not merely to govern but to erase Jewish distinctiveness. He bans circumcision, desecrates the Sabbath, and even enters the temple, setting up an altar to Zeus within its sacred courts. For the Jews, this is more than political oppression. It is sacrilege. The covenant itself is under assault. Some yield, blending into Hellenistic life. Others resist in secret, clinging to their traditions at great personal cost. Stories of martyrdom emerge, like that of a mother and her 7 sons, who endure torture and death rather than break the commandments. Their courage becomes a rallying cry for faith under fire. In this crucible, the Jewish identity is sharpened once again. The exile had taught them to live without land or temple. Now they must learn to live without compromise in the face of cultural assimilation. The question looms: can a small people, surrounded by the vastness of Greek culture, remain faithful to their covenant God? The answer will come in flames of rebellion, but for now, the seeds are planted. The Hellenistic age is not merely a chapter of oppression. It is a test of survival, a proving ground where the Jewish people will define who they are in a world that demands conformity. The struggle against Hellenism is more than historical. It is timeless. Every generation of Jews, and indeed every people of faith, will face the same question: how to live in the world without losing the essence of who they are. The clash between Hellenism and Jewish faith finally explodes into open rebellion. The spark comes during the reign of Antiochus IV Epiphanes, a king determined to erase Jewish distinctiveness and enforce uniform worship of Greek gods. His decrees outlaw circumcision, Sabbath observance, and study of the Torah. Copies of the sacred scrolls are seized and burned. The temple itself is desecrated when he erects an altar to Zeus and sacrifices unclean animals upon it. To many Jews, this is the ultimate humiliation, not only political domination, but an assault on the very covenant that defines them as a people. The tension reaches a breaking point in the town of Modian. There, a priest named Mattathias is commanded to offer sacrifice to a Greek idol. Refusing, he declares with defiance, "Though all the nations obey the king and each forsakes the religion of their fathers, I and my sons will walk in the covenant of our ancestors." When another Jew steps forward to comply with the decree, Mattathias, overcome with zeal, strikes him down, along with the king's officer. With this act, he and his 5 sons ignite the fire of rebellion. Mattathias flees into the hills with his family and others who refuse to bow to Antiochus. There they wage guerrilla warfare against the Seleucid forces, striking quickly and disappearing into the wilderness. After Mattathias's death, leadership passes to his son Judah, known by his nickname Maccabee, the Hammer. Judah Maccabee proves to be both a fierce warrior and an inspiring leader. Though vastly outnumbered and outarmed, his small band of fighters rely on surprise attacks, intimate knowledge of the terrain, and their unshakable conviction that they fight not merely for survival, but for God's law. The Seleucid armies march in overwhelming force, yet time and again, the Maccabees achieve victories that seem impossible. To their followers, it is clear, this is not only a battle of men, but of heaven and earth. The climax comes in 164 BCE. After years of struggle, Judah and his forces recapture Jerusalem. Entering the defiled temple, they find altars to foreign gods and filth where once the presence of the Lord dwelt. With grief and determination, they cleanse the sanctuary, rebuild the altar, and rededicate the temple to the God of Israel. The celebration of this event becomes known as Hanukkah, the Festival of Lights, a yearly reminder that even in the darkest times, the flame of faith endures. The revolt does not end with the rededication. The Maccabees continue to fight, eventually establishing a period of Jewish independence under the Hasmonean dynasty. For the first time in centuries, Jews govern themselves, free from the dictates of foreign kings. Though the dynasty will bring its own challenges, the achievement is extraordinary. Against the greatest empire of the age, a small, determined people reclaimed their faith, their temple, and their land. The Maccabean revolt is more than history. It is a story of courage against impossible odds, of ordinary men and women who refuse to surrender their covenant. It shows how faith can inspire resistance, how memory can sustain identity, and how light can triumph over darkness. The victory of the Maccabees was more than a military triumph. It was the rebirth of Jewish independence. After generations under foreign domination, the Jewish people once again governed themselves. The dynasty founded by Judah's brothers and descendants came to be known as the Hasmoneans, a line of priest-kings who combined both religious and political authority. At first, their rule was celebrated as the fulfillment of long-awaited dreams. The temple had been purified, the land reclaimed, and the law restored. The people looked to their leaders with hope that the covenant nation would flourish again, free from the grip of empire. But independence brought new challenges. Governing a land is far more complex than winning it back. The Hasmonean rulers faced external threats on every side. The Seleucids in Syria still posed danger, and neighboring peoples, Samaritans, Idumeans, and others, clashed with the Jews over territory and identity. To defend themselves, the Hasmoneans strengthened their armies and expanded their borders. In time, they controlled much of the land once held by David and Solomon, and even forcibly converted some conquered peoples to Judaism. What had begun as a fight for survival now transformed into a small empire of its own. Yet power carries its own temptations. The Hasmoneans were priests by heritage, descendants of the family of Mattathias, but they assumed the kingship as well. For some Jews, this was troubling. Kingship was meant to belong to the line of David, not the priesthood. By merging the two roles, the Hasmoneans blurred sacred boundaries, raising questions about legitimacy and faithfulness. Within the Jewish community, divisions deepened. Some supported the Hasmoneans as defenders of the nation and protectors of the temple. Others saw them as corrupt, too entangled with foreign influences, and straying from the spirit of the covenant. Two main groups began to emerge: the Pharisees, who emphasized strict devotion to the law and separation from impurity, and the Sadducees, who were closely aligned with the priestly aristocracy and often supported the Hasmoneans. This religious and political rivalry would only intensify in the years ahead. Despite internal conflict, the dynasty left lasting marks. Under Hasmonean rule, the temple became the center of national life once again. Festivals like Hanukkah kept alive the memory of resistance and faith. Jewish identity was preserved, sharpened by both victory and controversy. The Hasmoneans gave their people something precious: the chance to live as a nation, not just as a scattered community under foreign kings. But their independence was fragile. Rome, the rising power in the West, began casting its gaze eastward. Rivalries within the Hasmonean family eventually invited Roman intervention, setting the stage for a new chapter of foreign domination. By the middle of the 1st century BCE, Jewish self-rule was fading, replaced by Roman control and puppet kings. The Hasmonean dynasty is remembered with mixed feelings, a time of courage and pride, but also of compromise and corruption. They remind us that freedom is not only won on the battlefield, it must also be guarded in the halls of leadership and in the hearts of the people. The dream of a just and faithful kingdom remained alive, but it would take a very different form than anyone expected. As the Hasmonean dynasty expanded its reach, storm clouds gathered on the horizon. Far to the west, a new power was rising: Rome. What began as a small city-state had grown into a formidable empire, stretching across the Mediterranean world. By the 1st century BCE, Rome's legions dominated Greece, Asia Minor, and Egypt. Inevitably, their gaze turned toward Judea. Internal strife within the Hasmonean family created the perfect opportunity for Roman intervention. Rival brothers Hyrcanus II and Aristobulus II fought bitterly over the throne, each seeking foreign allies to strengthen their claim. In 63 BCE, both appealed to Pompey the Great, a Roman general, to arbitrate their dispute. But Rome did not come as a neutral mediator, it came as conqueror. Pompey marched into Jerusalem, besieging the city. When the walls fell, he entered the Holy of Holies itself, an act of sacrilege that shocked the Jewish people. Though Pompey refrained from looting the temple treasures, the message was clear: Judea was now under Rome's shadow. At first, Rome allowed the Hasmoneans to retain some authority, but as client kings rather than independent rulers. In time, Roman influence tightened, and the dynasty weakened. In their place rose a new ruler, backed by Rome: Herod the Great. Herod was an Idumean by descent, not of David's line, but he secured his throne through loyalty to Rome and ruthless elimination of rivals. His reign, beginning in 37 BCE, marked a turning point in Jewish history. Herod was a complex figure. On one hand, he was a master builder, leaving a legacy of monumental works that transformed the land. He rebuilt and expanded the temple in Jerusalem, making it one of the most magnificent structures in the ancient world. He fortified cities, constructed palaces, and even built the great port city of Caesarea. For some, these achievements symbolized prosperity and pride. Yet Herod's reign was also marked by fear and cruelty. Paranoid about losing power, he executed rivals, members of the Hasmonean family, and even his own wife and sons. Though he restored the temple's grandeur, many Jews viewed him with suspicion, seeing him as a foreigner imposed by Rome and a tyrant who cared more for power than piety. Rome's presence reshaped Jewish life in deeper ways. Taxes weighed heavily on the people, enriching the empire while draining the land. Roman governors and soldiers enforced order with brutality, fueling resentment. Religious divisions sharpened. Pharisees emphasized separation and purity. Sadducees aligned with priestly power and Rome. Essenes withdrew to the desert in pursuit of holiness, and Zealots plotted revolt. The dream of independence, once realized under the Maccabees, now seemed distant again. The arrival of Rome was not just another chapter of foreign rule. It was the beginning of centuries of domination that would test the Jewish people like never before. Rome was stronger, more organized, and more enduring than any empire before it. Its rule would eventually bring both devastation and dispersion, shaping the destiny of the Jewish people for millennia. The Hasmoneans had kindled the flame of independence, but Rome's iron grip threatened to snuff it out. Still, as history would prove again and again, the Jewish people would endure, even under the might of the greatest empire the world had yet seen. With Rome firmly entrenched in Judea, daily life for the Jewish people became a constant balance between survival and resistance. Taxes were heavy, collected not only by local officials but by Roman authorities who demanded loyalty to the empire above all else. For ordinary farmers and craftsmen, the burden was crushing. The land promised to Abraham seemed no longer their own, but a province of a vast empire ruled from faraway Rome. At the center of Jewish identity stood the temple in Jerusalem, magnificently rebuilt by Herod the Great. Pilgrims from across the land streamed into its courts during Passover, Sukkot, and Shavuot, bringing sacrifices and offerings. The temple was the pride of the nation, a reminder of God's presence among his people. Yet even here, Rome's shadow lingered. A fortress known as the Antonia, garrisoned with Roman soldiers, overlooked the Temple Mount, a visible symbol of foreign dominance. The sight of Gentile troops watching over sacred worship was a bitter humiliation for many. The Jewish community was divided in its response to Roman rule. The Pharisees, respected teachers of the law, emphasized strict adherence to the Torah and the oral traditions, believing that holiness and separation were the keys to survival. The Sadducees, drawn largely from the priestly elite, aligned themselves with Rome, managing the temple and maintaining political influence. Meanwhile, the Essenes withdrew to the wilderness, forming ascetic communities near the Dead Sea, convinced that society had become corrupt, and that only through purity and isolation could they remain faithful. And then there were the Zealots, fiery revolutionaries who rejected compromise and prepared for armed resistance, convinced that God would deliver his people once they rose in defiance. Beneath these divisions pulsed a deep, restless hope. Centuries of foreign domination had not erased the memory of the covenant or the promises spoken by the prophets. Many awaited a deliverer, a Messiah, who would free them from oppression, restore the throne of David, and bring about God's kingdom on earth. This expectation shaped daily prayers, kindled secret dreams, and made the presence of Rome feel not just like political control, but an obstacle to divine destiny. The tension was ever present. Minor uprisings flared, often crushed with brutal efficiency by Roman legions. Crucifixion, Rome's most gruesome punishment, lined roads with the bodies of rebels as a warning to others. Yet each act of defiance, though costly, kept the flame of resistance alive. Every injustice, every tax demanded, every soldier's insult fueled the question whispered in synagogues and homes. How long, O Lord? Under Rome, Jewish life became a paradox. Oppressed yet hopeful, humiliated yet proud, fractured yet united by memory and faith. The people endured foreign domination, but they carried within them the unshakable conviction that they were more than subjects of an empire. They were heirs to a covenant that no empire could erase. This age of Roman rule was the crucible in which new movements, new sects, and new interpretations of faith arose. Seeds that would profoundly shape not only Jewish history but the history of the entire world. The tension between Rome and the Jewish people could not remain contained forever. For decades, resentment simmered. Heavy taxes drained the land, Roman governors exploited their positions, and the ever-present legions reminded Judea that it was a conquered province. Yet beneath these daily humiliations burned something deeper, the conviction that God had promised freedom, and that his people were never meant to bow to idols or emperors. The spark came in 66 CE, when the Roman procurator Gessius Florus seized silver from the temple treasury to cover imperial expenses. Outrage erupted across Jerusalem. Crowds mocked Florus, parading with empty baskets as if to say, "You've stolen even the bread from our tables." Florus responded with brutal violence, massacring thousands and crucifying innocents. Instead of quelling rebellion, his cruelty ignited it. The people, united in fury, rose against Rome. At first, the revolt was astonishingly successful. Zealots and other rebels overwhelmed Roman garrisons, seizing Jerusalem and driving the occupiers out of much of Judea. Fortresses fell into Jewish hands, and for a brief, heady moment, it seemed as though the dream of independence might be within reach once more. Coins were even minted, boldly inscribed with phrases like, "For the freedom of Zion." The nation's heart pulsed with hope, recalling the days of the Maccabees when impossible odds had turned into miraculous victory. But Rome was no ordinary enemy. The empire's legions were disciplined, seasoned, and relentless. In 67 CE, General Vespasian and his son Titus marched with overwhelming force into Galilee. Town after town fell, often with horrific slaughter. The historian Josephus, himself a Jewish commander captured by Rome, later recorded the devastation. Villages burned, fields ruined, thousands killed or enslaved. Galilee was crushed, but Jerusalem remained defiant. Inside the holy city, however, unity unraveled. Factions of rebels fought one another as bitterly as they fought Rome. Zealots, moderates, and rival leaders clashed over strategy, resources, and vision. Supplies dwindled as they burned one another's food stores in civil strife. Instead of standing together, Jerusalem tore itself apart from within, a tragedy that weakened the city at the very moment it needed strength the most. Meanwhile, Rome advanced inexorably. By 69 CE, Vespasian was declared emperor, leaving Titus to complete the conquest of Judea. The stage was set for a showdown that would determine not just the fate of Jerusalem, but the future of Jewish life for centuries to come. The revolt had begun with hope, with the vision of a free people worshiping God in their land, unshackled from foreign domination. But as the fires of war spread, that hope was threatened by both external might and internal division. The Jewish people had risen once again against empire, but this time the cost would be greater than any they had faced before. The Great Revolt was no longer a question of if Rome would respond, but how utterly it would crush all who defied it. By the spring of 70 CE, the Roman legions under Titus had encircled Jerusalem. The city, perched high on its hills, was swollen with people. Pilgrims from across Judea had come for Passover, only to find themselves trapped when the Romans closed in. What should have been a festival of remembrance and joy became a crucible of fear, hunger, and blood. Jerusalem's defenders numbered in the tens of thousands, but they were divided. Rival factions of zealots and moderates battled one another even as the Romans built siege works outside the walls. The historian Josephus, who watched the events unfold, lamented that the city's greatest enemy was not Rome, but its own civil strife. In their zeal, the factions destroyed each other's food stores, thinking it would force unity in fighting Rome. Instead, it condemned the city to starvation. The Romans began their siege with relentless precision. Towers and battering rams rolled toward the walls, while engineers built ramparts to breach the city's defenses. Jewish defenders hurled stones, poured boiling oil, and launched flaming torches to repel the assault. For weeks, the Romans were beaten back. The city's multiple walls made progress slow, and Jerusalem's fighters, though divided, fought with desperate courage. But hunger gnawed at the people within. As supplies dwindled, famine spread. Bread disappeared, then grain, then even scraps of grass were fought over in the streets. Stories tell of people breaking into one another's homes in search of crumbs. The cries of starving children echoed through the alleys, and despair filled the air. The city that once overflowed with the songs of pilgrims now groaned under the weight of suffering. Titus, hoping to crush both spirit and resistance, ordered the crucifixion of captives before the city walls. Day after day, hundreds were executed, their bodies left hanging as a grim warning. Yet still, Jerusalem resisted. The people clung to the temple, believing that God's dwelling place would never fall. The Romans pressed closer. The outer walls were breached, then the second wall. Each victory came with brutal slaughter. Still, the inner stronghold remained. The Temple Mount, towering above the city, its white stones gleaming even amid smoke and fire. For the defenders, the temple was not just a fortress. It was the heart of their faith, the symbol of God's covenant. To lose it would be unthinkable. Inside the city, desperation turned to madness. Factions, even in the face of destruction, continued to war with one another. Mothers wept, fathers despaired, and yet prayers rose in the temple courts, mingling hope with dread. The siege dragged on, each day a tightening noose. From the hills, the Romans watched their prey weaken. From within the walls, the Jews held on to faith, even as famine and infighting consumed them. Both sides knew that the end was near. The only question was how terrible the final blow would be. The siege of Jerusalem was more than a military campaign. It was a tragedy of faith, division, and empire. And soon, its climax would come in fire. The summer sun of 70 CE bore down upon Jerusalem as the Roman siege reached its final and most terrible act. The Temple Mount, long seen as the heart of Jewish faith and the center of God's presence, stood as the last bastion of resistance. Its gleaming white stones and golden roof, visible for miles, had been a source of pride and hope for generations. To the defenders, it was unthinkable that God would allow it to fall. To the Romans, it was the ultimate prize, the symbol of Jewish defiance to be crushed once and for all. Titus had at first hoped to spare the temple, desiring it as a trophy to display Rome's power. Yet, in the chaos of battle, fury consumed both sides. Roman soldiers clashed with desperate Jewish defenders who hurled stones, arrows, and even flaming torches to repel their advance. The fighting raged through the courtyards, filling the sacred grounds with blood. The air was thick with smoke, cries of anguish, and the clash of steel. Then, in a moment that would forever alter history, flames were set to the temple. Some accounts say a Roman soldier, defying orders, hurled a torch into the structure. Others suggest it was the fury of battle itself that lit the fire. Whatever the cause, the result was the same. The sanctuary that had stood for centuries, rebuilt and expanded by Herod into one of the wonders of the ancient world, erupted in flames. The fire spread with terrifying speed, devouring cedar beams, golden furnishings, and the sacred curtain that once veiled the Holy of Holies. Josephus describes the scene with haunting words. Priests leaping into the flames with the treasures of the temple rather than see them desecrated, worshippers slain at the altar, and smoke rising so high it seemed to blot out the heavens. The roar of the inferno mingled with the cries of the people, a sound of grief unlike any other. Titus, surveying the destruction, could no longer stop it. The temple was reduced to rubble and ash. Soldiers carried off what treasures they could: golden vessels, menorahs, and sacred trumpets, parading them later in Rome as spoils of victory. The Ark of the Covenant, long gone since the Babylonian conquest centuries earlier, was nowhere to be found. What remained was ruin. For the Jewish people, the destruction of the temple was not just the loss of a building, but the shattering of identity. Sacrifices ceased. Pilgrimages ended. The center of worship, where heaven and earth had once met, was gone. Survivors stood in stunned silence, unable to imagine a faith without the house of God. And yet, even amid ashes, memory and resilience stirred. The rabbis who survived began to ask, how can we carry the covenant without a temple? Their answers would reshape Judaism forever, turning it from a faith centered on sacrifice to one rooted in prayer, study, and community. The burning of the temple was a tragedy beyond words, but it was not the end of the Jewish story. Out of the fire, new forms of life would emerge, keeping alive the promise that no empire could extinguish. The destruction of the temple was not the end of Rome's fury. It was only the climax. After the flames consumed the sanctuary, Jerusalem itself descended into complete ruin. What had once been a city of pilgrims, priests, and kings became a battlefield of rubble and blood. Roman legions stormed through the streets, cutting down all who resisted. Homes were set ablaze, marketplaces looted, and families torn apart. Josephus, the Jewish historian who witnessed the war, records scenes so harrowing they defy imagination. The aged struck down in their doorways, children torn from their mothers, and rivers of blood flowing through the alleys. Those who sought refuge in the temple courts were slaughtered amid the smoke and fire, their cries rising like a final lament for Zion. Starvation, which had plagued the city for months, reached its cruelest end. With food gone, the people had already turned to desperate measures, boiling leather, gnawing on scraps of wood, and even, in whispers too grim to bear, darker acts of survival. The siege had starved not only bodies but hope itself. When the walls were finally breached, there was little strength left to resist. Titus, though he had once considered sparing the city, now ordered its total destruction. The walls were torn down, the strongholds dismantled, and the city reduced to a wasteland. Only a handful of towers and sections of wall were left standing, grim markers of what had once been Jerusalem's pride. The Romans wanted the world to know no rebellion against the empire would go unpunished. Survivors faced grim fates. Thousands were slaughtered outright. Tens of thousands were taken captive, marched in chains to Rome and other provinces. Many were sold as slaves, scattered to foreign lands far from the hills of Judea. Others were forced into gladiatorial games, made to fight wild beasts for the entertainment of Roman crowds. The proud citizens of Jerusalem became a spectacle of humiliation in the empire's arenas. And yet, even in this devastation, the memory of Zion endured. Those who survived carried with them stories of what had been lost: the temple, the city, the dream of freedom. They remembered the songs once sung in the courts of the Lord, and though the city lay in ruins, those songs would echo in synagogues and homes across the diaspora. The fall of Jerusalem was a wound that would never fully heal, but it also became a symbol, a reminder of both the fragility of human power and the endurance of faith. Rome celebrated its victory with triumphal arches and parades, displaying the treasures of the temple as trophies of conquest. But for the Jewish people, the destruction marked the beginning of a new chapter, one of survival without sovereignty, worship without a temple, and identity carried not in land or city, but in memory and covenant. The fall of Jerusalem was devastation beyond measure. Yet within the ashes, a question began to take shape. If the city and temple were gone, what would it mean to be Jewish now? The answer would define the centuries to come. While Jerusalem burned and her people were scattered, one fortress still held out against Rome: Masada. Rising nearly 1,300 feet above the Judean desert, this plateau of stone had been fortified decades earlier by King Herod as a place of refuge. Now, in the aftermath of the Great Revolt, it became the final stronghold of Jewish resistance. A band of rebels known as the Sicarii had seized Masada years earlier, and by 70 CE, after the fall of Jerusalem, nearly 1,000 men, women, and children had taken refuge within its walls. Their leader was Eleazar ben Yair, a man of fiery words and unbreakable resolve. To him and his followers, Masada was not just a fortress. It was the last outpost of Jewish freedom in a world ruled by Rome. The Romans, determined to extinguish every ember of rebellion, turned their eyes toward Masada in 72 CE. Led by the governor Flavius Silva, the 10th Legion marched into the desert, encircling the mountain with camps and a wall to prevent escape. Looking up from the barren sands, they saw the fortress looming above, defiant and unreachable. But Rome's strength was patience and engineering. For months, the legion built a massive ramp against the western side of the mountain. Day after day, Jewish eyes from the fortress watched as the ramp rose higher and higher, a silent inevitability. Rocks and timber were hauled across the desert, slaves toiled under the lash, and the great earthen incline grew. The defenders rained down arrows and stones, but the Romans pressed on. Slowly, Rome reached toward Masada's gates. Inside the fortress, Eleazar ben Yair gathered his people. He knew the Romans would show no mercy. Those not slaughtered would be enslaved, paraded, or worse. In a final speech, recorded later by Josephus, he urged his followers to embrace freedom even in death. "Let us die unenslaved, and leave this world as free men and women." His words echoed through the halls of stone, stirring courage and despair in equal measure. When the Romans at last breached the walls, silence greeted them. They found no battle, no resistance. Instead, they discovered a haunting scene. The defenders had chosen death over captivity. Families lay together, their lives ended by their own hands. Only a handful of survivors remained, women and children who had hidden, left to tell the story. Masada was Rome's victory, but it was also a testament to defiance. The mountain became a symbol for generations, a place where the Jewish spirit had refused to bow, even at the edge of despair. While Jerusalem's ruins spoke of tragedy, Masada whispered of courage, however grim. With Masada's fall, the great revolt ended. Judea was shattered, her people dispersed, her temple gone. Yet the story of the Jews was not extinguished. Across deserts and seas, in exile and diaspora, they carried their faith, their memory, and their hope. Masada marked the end of one chapter and the beginning of survival in a world without Zion. With Jerusalem in ruins, the temple destroyed, and Masada fallen, the Jewish people faced a question unlike any they had ever known. How could their faith survive without its center? For centuries, the temple had been the heart of Jewish life. Pilgrims had traveled from distant lands to bring offerings, priests had tended the altars, and festivals had been celebrated in its courts. Now, the sacred house of God lay in ashes, and Judea groaned under Roman rule. Many feared it was the end, but out of devastation came reinvention. In the coastal town of Jabna, a new beginning quietly took root. After the revolt, a respected sage named Yohanan ben Zakkai, who had managed to escape Jerusalem before its fall, gained permission from the Romans to establish a school of learning. This academy at Jabna became the seed from which Judaism would be reborn. Here, the focus shifted from sacrifice to scripture, from temple ritual to Torah study and prayer. No longer could the people gather in Jerusalem's courts, but they could gather in homes and synagogues. No longer could priests mediate at the altar, but teachers, the rabbis, could guide communities in understanding God's law. In place of the temple, study became the sanctuary, words became the offering, memory became the bond. The rabbis of Jabna and their successors debated and preserved the oral traditions of the faith, weaving them into teachings that could sustain a people without a land. Over time, these discussions formed the Mishnah, the foundation of what would later become the Talmud, texts that would guide Jewish life across continents and centuries. Through this transformation, Judaism shifted from being centered on a single sacred space to being a portable faith, carried wherever its people wandered. This rebirth was not only religious but cultural. Festivals like Passover and Sukkot, once centered on sacrifices in Jerusalem, were reshaped into home rituals and synagogue prayers. The Sabbath became the heartbeat of weekly life, a reminder of covenant even in exile. The mezuzah on the doorpost, the candles lit on Friday evening, the recitation of prayers, all became daily sanctuaries in miniature. What was lost in grandeur was regained in resilience. It was not an easy transformation. Many mourned what had been lost and longed for restoration. Yet, in adapting, the Jewish people ensured their survival. Empires could burn cities and topple walls, but they could not destroy memory, teaching, or hope. By rooting their identity in text and tradition rather than place, the Jews became a people who carried their homeland within them, wherever they went. The fall of Jerusalem could have ended the story. Instead, it became a turning point. From the ashes of the temple rose a new kind of Judaism, rabbinic, resilient, enduring. It would accompany the Jewish people into exile, guide them through centuries of wandering, and keep alive the vision that one day, the God of Israel would gather his people again. In the wake of Jerusalem's destruction, the Jewish people entered a new era, one of dispersion. The diaspora was not entirely new. Long before Rome's conquest, Jewish communities had taken root in Babylon, Alexandria, and cities across the Mediterranean. But after 70 CE, and especially after the crushing of later revolts, dispersal became the defining reality. Judea remained scarred and impoverished, its population reduced by war, famine, and slavery. Those who survived were carried far beyond their homeland, scattered like seeds into the vast soil of the Roman Empire. Some were taken by force. Captives marched in chains through Rome, displayed in triumphal parades beneath the arches of victory. Many were sold into slavery in Italy, North Africa, or Gaul, their lives shattered but their traditions carried in memory. Others fled voluntarily, seeking refuge in lands where they might rebuild. The result was a mosaic of Jewish communities spread across the empire, each shaped by its surroundings yet bound by shared faith. In Alexandria, one of the great cities of learning, Jews had long flourished as merchants, scholars, and artisans. Here, Hebrew scripture had been translated into Greek centuries earlier, producing the Septuagint and allowing Jewish thought to interact with Hellenistic philosophy. After Jerusalem's fall, Alexandria's Jewish population grew, though it, too, faced periodic violence and persecution. In Babylon, far beyond Rome's reach, the Jewish community remained strong. Descendants of those exiled centuries earlier by the Babylonians continued to thrive along the Euphrates, establishing academies that would later rival those of Judea in shaping Jewish thought. In time, these centers would produce the Babylonian Talmud, a monumental work that ensured the continuity of Jewish tradition. In Rome itself, Jews became both visible and vulnerable. They served as traders and artisans, some rising to wealth, others languishing in poverty. Synagogues dotted the city, quiet sanctuaries where prayers in Hebrew rose amid the noise of the empire's capital. Yet life in Rome was precarious, tolerated at times, persecuted at others, always subject to the whims of emperors. The synagogue became the anchor of diaspora life. No longer tied to a single temple, Jews gathered in local houses of prayer to read Torah, sing psalms, and preserve their identity. These synagogues were not only places of worship but also centers of community, courts of justice, schools of learning, and shelters for the poor. Across the Mediterranean world, synagogues linked scattered communities in a shared rhythm of faith. Diaspora life also meant adaptation. Jews spoke the languages of their neighbors, Greek, Latin, Aramaic, while retaining Hebrew for prayer. They traded in foreign markets, dressed in local fashions, and yet held on to rituals that marked them as distinct. Sabbath rest, dietary laws, circumcision. This balance of integration and separation would define Jewish life for centuries to come. Scattered though they were, the Jews carried their story with them. In distant lands, far from Zion, they remembered Jerusalem in prayers and psalms, vowing never to forget. Exile was painful, but it was not an erasure. It was a beginning, the shaping of a global people whose strength would lie not in one place, but in their ability to remain one across many places. Though Jerusalem had fallen and the temple lay in ashes, the Jewish desire for freedom did not vanish. 60 years after the Great Revolt, a new uprising ignited, one that would shake the Roman Empire once again. This was the Bar Kokhba Revolt, a desperate and fiery attempt to reclaim independence, and one of the most tragic chapters in Jewish history. The seeds of rebellion were planted under the Emperor Hadrian. At first, some Jews hoped Hadrian might restore peace and even rebuild Jerusalem, but their hopes were betrayed. Hadrian announced his plan to transform the Holy City into a Roman colony called Aelia Capitolina, complete with pagan shrines where the temple had once stood. To add insult to injury, he banned key practices of Jewish identity, including circumcision. These acts were more than political, they were an assault on the very heart of Jewish faith. In this climate of anger and despair, a leader arose, Simon Bar Kokhba, later remembered as Bar Kokhba, son of the star. To many, he appeared as the long-awaited deliverer, perhaps even the Messiah foretold in prophecy. Rabbi Akiva, one of the greatest sages of the age, publicly proclaimed him the one destined to lead Israel to redemption. With such hope, thousands rallied to his cause. At first, the revolt was astonishingly successful. Between 132 and 134 CE, Bar Kokhba's forces recaptured much of Judea. Entire Roman garrisons were overwhelmed. The rebels minted their own coins, boldly inscribed with phrases like, "Year one of the redemption of Israel." For a fleeting moment, it seemed as though Jewish sovereignty had returned, a revival of the dream that had burned since the days of the Maccabees. But Rome was not an empire to be defied for long. The rebellion provoked a massive response. Emperor Hadrian dispatched some of his finest generals, including Julius Severus, along with legions drawn from across the empire. The war turned brutal. Villages were razed, fields destroyed, and entire populations slaughtered. Roman strategy focused on attrition, cutting off supplies, isolating strongholds, and wearing down resistance. Bar Kokhba's last refuge was the fortress of Batar, a stronghold near Jerusalem. In 135 CE it fell. The defeat was catastrophic. According to later accounts, the blood of the slain flowed in rivers, and the land was littered with corpses. Bar Kokhba himself was killed, his dream extinguished in the ruins of battle. The aftermath was devastating beyond measure. Hadrian sought not only to punish but to erase. Judea was renamed Syria-Palestina, a deliberate attempt to sever Jewish ties to the land. Jews were banned from entering Jerusalem, except on the day of mourning for the temple. Survivors were enslaved, executed, or scattered. Rabbi Akiva, who had hailed Bar Kokhba as Messiah, was tortured and killed by the Romans, becoming one of the most revered martyrs of the Jewish people. The Bar Kokhba revolt ended with tragedy, yet it also hardened Jewish identity for the centuries to come. Without sovereignty, without temple, without land, the people turned ever more toward Torah, prayer, and memory. They learned to survive not through armies, but through resilience of spirit. The dream of freedom was crushed, but it was not forgotten. From then on, Jewish life would be lived in exile, yet with eyes always turned toward Zion. After the crushing defeat of the Bar Kokhba revolt, Judea was left devastated. Its fields were burned, its villages depopulated, and its people scattered. Rome had done more than conquer, it had sought to erase. Yet the Jewish story did not end with ruin. Instead, it found new life far from the hills of Zion, in the fertile lands of Mesopotamia. Babylon, long home to a Jewish community since the exile of 586 BCE, now became the heart of Jewish life. Unlike Judea, it was beyond the reach of Roman persecution. Under the rule of the Parthian and later Sasanian empires, Jews were allowed to live, trade, and govern their communities with relative autonomy. Here, free from the crushing weight of Roman oppression, Jewish scholarship and creativity flourished. Two cities in particular rose to prominence: Sura and Pumbedita. These towns housed great academies where rabbis gathered to debate, preserve, and expand the teachings of their ancestors. The academies became not merely schools, but the beating heart of Jewish identity. In their halls, questions were asked and answered, traditions preserved and reshaped, and a new foundation for Jewish survival laid down. The focus was the Torah, both written and oral. Rabbis studied the Mishnah, a collection of laws and traditions compiled in the land of Israel, and they expanded upon it with endless discussion. Their debates were not abstract exercises but practical guidance. How does one keep the Sabbath in a foreign land? How does one maintain dietary laws in a non-Jewish marketplace? How does a community preserve justice and compassion amid exile? Every question mattered, for it was through these questions that Jewish life remained intact. Over centuries, these teachings coalesced into the Babylonian Talmud, a monumental work that became the cornerstone of Jewish law and thought. More than a book, it was a conversation across generations, a living dialogue that bound communities together across distance and time. The Talmud did what the temple no longer could. It gave the Jewish people a center, not in stone, but in words. Life in Babylon was not without hardship. Jews faced periods of tension with local rulers, occasional persecution, and the constant challenge of living as a minority in a vast empire. Yet, compared to the destruction in Judea, Babylon offered stability. Communities thrived as farmers, merchants, and scholars. They built synagogues, composed prayers, and wove rituals into daily life that reminded them of who they were and where they came from. What emerged in Babylon was more than survival, it was renewal. The rabbis transformed exile into a source of strength, teaching that God's presence was not confined to a place, but could dwell wherever his people gathered in study and prayer. In this way, Babylon became the cradle of the Judaism that would endure for centuries. Portable, resilient, and deeply rooted in tradition. Though far from Zion, the Jews of Babylon never forgot Jerusalem. Every prayer turned toward it, every festival remembered it, and every marriage vow recalled the hope of return. But until that day, they built a home of faith in exile, one that would shape the destiny of their people across the world. While Babylon became a flourishing center of Jewish thought, life for Jews who remained under Roman rule grew increasingly complex and often perilous. The empire that had crushed Jerusalem and banned Jews from their holy city now transformed in ways that would shape Jewish destiny for millennia. In the centuries after the destruction of the Temple, the Roman Empire shifted from paganism to Christianity. At first, Christianity was a small sect within Judaism, centered around the teachings of Jesus of Nazareth and his early followers. But as decades passed, it grew, spreading across the empire, especially after Constantine's conversion in the 4th century CE. By 313 CE, with the Edict of Milan, Christianity was legalized. Soon after, it became the favored religion of the empire and eventually its official faith. For Jews, this transformation created a new reality. Under pagan Rome, they were a conquered people, taxed and sometimes persecuted, but generally tolerated as one of many ancient religions. Under Christian Rome, however, they became something else, witnesses to a faith that now claimed to be the fulfillment of their own. The Church taught that the destruction of Jerusalem and the Temple was divine punishment for rejecting Jesus, casting Jews as a people condemned to wander. This theology would shadow Jewish existence in the West for centuries. Roman laws reflected this shift. Jews were allowed to practice their religion, but with increasing restrictions. They could not hold certain public offices, they were barred from building new synagogues, and their rights were gradually curtailed. The once vibrant community in Judea dwindled, while Jewish populations in Rome, North Africa, and Europe lived in precarious balance, protected at times by imperial decrees, yet always vulnerable to hostility. Despite these hardships, Jewish life persisted. Communities continued to gather in synagogues, where prayers replaced sacrifices, and Torah study replaced the rituals of the temple. Festivals and holy days carried memory forward. Passover recalled liberation, Yom Kippur called for repentance, and every Sabbath offered a taste of sacred rest in a world often hostile. Jewish leaders, known as patriarchs, guided their people in the land of Israel even after the revolts, though their authority waned as Babylonian academies grew more influential. The Jewish calendar was standardized, ensuring that scattered communities could celebrate holy days in unison, preserving unity across distance. At the same time, Jewish-Christian relations grew more strained. What began as a sibling rivalry hardened into opposition. As the church spread, it often defined itself against Judaism, emphasizing that it had replaced the old covenant with a new one. This left Jews increasingly isolated, not just politically, but spiritually in the eyes of their neighbors. Yet the resilience of the Jewish people shone through. In Rome, in North Africa, in Gaul and Spain, Jewish merchants traded, Jewish scholars taught, and Jewish families lit Sabbath candles. They endured discrimination and suspicion, but they carried their traditions into each new generation. The Age of Rome and the rise of Christianity marked the beginning of a long chapter of exile in Christian lands. It was a time of survival, adaptation, and faith under pressure. A foreshadowing of struggles yet to come, but also proof that the Jewish people, even in the shadow of empire, would not vanish. As the Roman Empire crumbled in the West and Byzantium carried its legacy in the East, a new world began to take shape. For the Jewish people, this meant entering the long and turbulent centuries of the Middle Ages, an era defined by two great forces, Christianity and Islam. Between the cross and the crescent, Jewish life would face both flourishing opportunities and devastating trials. In Christian Europe, Jews were a small minority, scattered across cities and villages from Italy to Gaul, from the Rhineland to Spain. They were often tolerated as necessary outsiders, skilled in trade, finance, and medicine, yet also viewed with suspicion, their presence explained by Christian theology as witnesses to the truth of the Church. This precarious position gave Jews a strange dual role, protected in some places, persecuted in others. Meanwhile, in the 7th century, Islam emerged from the Arabian Peninsula, spreading with extraordinary speed across the Middle East, North Africa, and into Spain. For Jews, the rise of Islam brought profound change. Under Islamic rule, Jews were classified as dhimmi, people of the book. They were granted protection and freedom to practice their religion, but with second-class status, paying a special tax and barred from certain privileges. Still, compared to life in much of Christian Europe, Islamic lands often offered relative stability and opportunity. In Muslim Spain, known as Al-Andalus, a golden age dawned. From the 9th to the 12th centuries, Jewish poets, philosophers, and scholars thrived under Muslim rulers. Figures like Samuel ibn Negrilla, a statesman and military leader, and Moses ibn Ezra, a celebrated poet, flourished in a society where Jewish learning mingled with Arabic culture. The greatest of them all, Moses ben Maimon Maimonides, would later write works that shaped both Jewish and wider philosophical thought, blending Torah wisdom with Aristotle and the rationalism of Islamic philosophy. In these centuries, Jewish culture reached heights of creativity that would echo for generations. Yet the Middle Ages were no paradise. In Christian Europe, waves of persecution often swept across Jewish communities. Accusations of deicide, the charge that Jews bore eternal guilt for the death of Jesus, fueled hostility. Restrictions on occupations forced many into roles such as moneylending, which further inflamed resentment. Pogroms, expulsions, and forced conversions punctuated Jewish existence, casting a shadow of fear over everyday life. Still, Jewish resilience endured. Communities built synagogues, preserved their traditions, and maintained networks of trade and scholarship across vast distances. In Christian lands, rabbis codified Jewish law in works like the Shulchan Aruch. In Muslim lands, Jewish poetry and philosophy flourished. The people carried their faith like a torch through both darkness and light, adapting to each empire, each ruler, each shifting tide of history. Between cross and crescent, the Jewish story in the Middle Ages was one of paradox. Persecution and prosperity, exile and creativity, despair and brilliance. It was a time when Jewish survival required both endurance and adaptability, qualities that would sustain them through the centuries ahead. In the centuries after the fall of the Western Roman Empire, Europe reshaped itself into a patchwork of Christian kingdoms. For the Jewish people living within these realms, the Middle Ages began as an uncertain era. At times, kings and bishops valued Jewish communities for their skills in trade, finance, and scholarship. At other times, Jews became convenient scapegoats, targeted in moments of crisis and fear. Life in Christian Europe was a delicate balance between protection and persecution. At first, some rulers offered patronage. The Merovingian and later Carolingian kings of France permitted Jewish merchants to trade across borders, recognizing their usefulness in connecting distant markets. In parts of Italy and along the Rhine, Jewish communities grew, building synagogues and establishing schools of learning. Their presence enriched the cultural and economic life of medieval Europe, even as they remained outsiders to the dominant Christian faith. But church doctrine cast a long shadow. Theologians such as Augustine argued that Jews should not be destroyed, but preserved in humiliation as witnesses to Christianity's truth. This reasoning meant that Jews were often allowed to exist, yet always under restrictions that marked them as separate and subordinate. Laws emerged limiting where Jews could live, what professions they could hold, and how they could interact with Christians. Intermarriage was forbidden, synagogues were restricted, and public visibility was often curtailed. One of the most defining roles forced upon Jews was moneylending. Since the church prohibited Christians from lending money with interest, Jews, barred from many other trades and professions, filled the gap. This work made them essential to medieval economies, but also bred resentment. Debtors often turned hatred into accusation, and rulers who had borrowed heavily could incite violence against Jewish lenders to erase their debts. What was economic necessity in times of prosperity became a source of blame in times of hardship. Persecution grew sharper in waves. In the 11th century, the call for the First Crusade unleashed violent mobs across the Rhineland. Entire Jewish communities in cities like Mainz, Speyer, and Worms were massacred by crusaders who, before marching to the Holy Land, sought to purify their path by attacking the enemies of Christ at home. Survivors recorded the horrors in dirges and chronicles, remembering them as a new destruction akin to the fall of Jerusalem. Yet even amid danger, Jewish life persisted. Families lit Sabbath candles in hidden courtyards. Scholars debated law and scripture in small study halls. Merchants carried goods across borders, linking Jewish communities from Spain to the Rhineland to Poland. Each synagogue became a fortress of memory, each prayer a reminder of hope. The paradox of medieval Christian Europe was this: Jews were indispensable to its economy and culture, yet resented for their difference, protected by kings when useful, yet abandoned or attacked when convenient. They lived always on the edge of uncertainty, carrying within their hearts the dream of Jerusalem while enduring the shadows of the cross. This was only the beginning of their medieval trials. Greater storms were yet to come. While Jewish communities in Christian Europe often lived under suspicion and fear, a very different chapter was unfolding in the Muslim-ruled lands of Spain, known as Al-Andalus. Beginning in the 8th century, the Iberian Peninsula became one of the brightest centers of Jewish life in the medieval world. Here, under Islamic rule, Jews not only survived but flourished, contributing to a cultural flowering that historians later called the Golden Age. The foundation of this age lay in the status of Jews as dhimmi, protected but subordinate peoples. They were required to pay a special tax and live under certain restrictions, yet compared to the hostility of much of Christian Europe, the Muslim rulers of Spain offered stability and opportunity. Jewish merchants thrived in the bustling markets of Córdoba and Granada. Jewish physicians served in royal courts, and Jewish poets and scholars wrote works that blended the wisdom of Hebrew scripture with the elegance of Arabic culture. One of the earliest and most influential figures of this age was Hasdai ibn Shaprat, a Jewish physician and diplomat in the court of the Caliph of Córdoba in the 10th century. Fluent in Arabic, Hebrew, and Latin, Hasdai became a bridge between cultures, negotiating with Christian kingdoms and fostering Jewish scholarship. His leadership turned Córdoba into a center of Jewish intellectual life, drawing scholars from across the diaspora. Poetry blossomed as well. Jewish writers like Solomon ibn Gabirol and Judah Halevi composed verses that rivaled their Muslim contemporaries. Their works celebrated God, the beauty of creation, and the longing for Zion, weaving Hebrew traditions into the rhythms and forms of Arabic poetry. In this way, the Jewish voice found expression not only in prayer but in art, philosophy, and literature, enriching both Jewish culture and the broader society around them. Perhaps the greatest mind to emerge from Al-Andalus was Moses ben Maimon, known as Maimonides. Born in Córdoba in the 12th century, he would later flee persecution when the more intolerant Almohad dynasty came to power. Eventually settling in Egypt, Maimonides became both a towering rabbi and a physician to the Sultan. His works, including the Guide for the Perplexed and his codification of Jewish law, would shape Jewish thought for centuries. Yet his intellectual roots lay in the vibrant exchanges of Muslim Spain, where Jewish, Islamic, and even classical Greek ideas mingled freely. But the Golden Age was not eternal. Shifts in political power brought waves of intolerance. The arrival of the Almohads in the 12th century, with their stricter interpretation of Islam, forced many Jews to flee or convert. Communities that had once flourished in Córdoba, Granada, and Seville dwindled, and the dream of coexistence began to fade. Still, the cultural legacy of that age endured, leaving behind a treasure of poetry, philosophy, and scholarship. For the Jewish people, Al-Andalus was proof that exile could yield brilliance, that faith and identity could thrive even far from Jerusalem. In the gardens of Spain, under the crescent moon, Jewish creativity reached heights that would inspire generations long after the Golden Age ended. The dawn of the Crusades in the late 11th century unleashed one of the darkest storms in Jewish medieval history. When Pope Urban II called Christians to take up the cross in 1095 and march to reclaim Jerusalem from Muslim rule, a fire of zeal swept across Europe. Yet before crusading armies ever reached the Holy Land, their fury turned inward, against Jewish communities living along the Rhine River, in cities like Mainz, Worms, and Speyer. For centuries, these Rhineland Jews had lived in fragile coexistence with their Christian neighbors. They served as traders, moneylenders, artisans, and scholars, building communities bound together by synagogues, schools, and traditions. But to the Crusaders, inflamed by preachers who spoke of holy war, Jews were branded as infidels no less than Muslims. Why travel thousands of miles to fight enemies of Christ? They asked. When such enemies live among us? In 1096, the People's Crusade, a ragtag band of knights, peasants, and zealots, swept through the Rhineland. What followed were massacres that shocked even some contemporaries. In Worms, Jews barricaded themselves in their homes and synagogues, but mobs broke in, slaughtering entire families. In Mainz, one of the most vibrant Jewish centers in Europe, hundreds chose martyrdom over forced conversion. Parents were said to have killed their own children to keep them from baptism, echoing the ancient resolve of Masada. Chroniclers recorded the horrors in haunting laments, searing them into Jewish memory as a new destruction of the temple. The First Crusades set a precedent. Subsequent crusades brought fresh waves of violence and fear. In 1146, during the Second Crusade, Bernard of Clairvaux himself had to intervene to restrain preachers who urged attacks on Jews. Yet, despite his words, pogroms spread again through parts of Europe. Each crusade left Jewish communities wary, vulnerable, and diminished, even when kings or bishops offered protection. Beyond the massacres, the Crusades altered Jewish existence in Europe. Suspicion deepened, fueled by myths and slanders. Blood libel accusations, false claims that Jews used Christian children in ritual sacrifice, began to spread in the 12th century, intensifying hostility. Economic restrictions grew tighter, pushing Jews further into the precarious role of moneylenders, a profession that guaranteed resentment. Yet the response of the Jewish people to these calamities was not only grief, but resilience. Out of the ashes of Mainz and Worms, new centers of learning arose. Rabbis such as Rashi in France offered commentary on scripture and Talmud that became cornerstones of Jewish study. Communities rebuilt synagogues, rededicated themselves to faith, and continued to teach their children the traditions of their ancestors. The Crusades were a turning point. They revealed the precariousness of Jewish life in Christian Europe, subject to the passions of mobs and the politics of kings. They also revealed the strength of Jewish endurance, a people who, even when surrounded by hostility, clung to their covenant and carried their memory of Zion. From the Rhineland massacres onward, Jewish communities knew that exile in Christendom would be marked by both survival and suffering. The Crusades etched into Jewish history the bitter lesson that faith could ignite not only devotion, but destruction. By the late Middle Ages, Jewish life in Christian Europe entered one of its most turbulent chapters, the Age of Expulsions. What began as scattered acts of hostility grew into systematic policies that uprooted entire communities, pushing Jews into exile after exile. The dream of stability in Christendom grew ever more elusive as kings, bishops, and towns turned against their Jewish neighbors. The first major expulsion came in England. In 1290, King Edward I issued the Edict of Expulsion, ordering all Jews to leave his kingdom. For over 2 centuries, Jews had lived in England, often serving as royal financiers and moneylenders. But resentment had mounted, fueled by debt, rumors of ritual murder, and clerical hostility. When Edward no longer found Jewish lenders useful and saw an opportunity to seize their assets, he cast them out. For nearly 400 years, Jews would be absent from England, their synagogues abandoned, their cemeteries neglected, until their return under Oliver Cromwell in the 17th century. France followed a similar path. Expulsions came in waves, as kings repeatedly banished Jews, then readmitted them for financial gain, only to drive them out again. The most decisive came in 1306, when King Philip IV ordered the expulsion of tens of thousands. Families were stripped of property, forced to abandon their homes with little more than what they could carry. Though some returned under later rulers, the cycle of expulsion and recall left deep scars, scattering Jewish communities across Europe. But the greatest blow of all came in Spain. For centuries, Spain had been home to one of the most brilliant centers of Jewish life, first under Muslim rule during the Golden Age, and later under Christian kings who, despite growing intolerance, still allowed Jewish communities to flourish. By the 15th century, however, pressures mounted. The Reconquista, the Christian reconquest of Spain, was nearly complete, and religious zeal grew ever sharper. The Spanish Inquisition, established in 1478, targeted conversos, Jews who had converted to Christianity, often under pressure, but who were suspected of secretly practicing Judaism. This atmosphere of suspicion and fear set the stage for catastrophe. In 1492, the same year Christopher Columbus sailed westward, Ferdinand and Isabella issued the Alhambra Decree. All Jews must either convert to Christianity or leave Spain. Tens of thousands chose exile, families who had lived in Iberia for generations. Merchants, scholars, poets, rabbis were forced to abandon everything. They scattered to Portugal, North Africa, the Ottoman Empire, and beyond. The Ottoman Sultan Bayezid too welcomed many, famously remarking that Spain's loss was his gain. Still, for those who fled, the expulsion was a trauma etched deep into collective memory. The age of expulsions reshaped the Jewish world. Communities that had once been rooted in Western Europe shifted eastward, especially into Poland and Lithuania, where rulers offered new opportunities and relative safety. The pain of exile, however, lingered in Jewish prayer, poetry, and song, a reminder that home could be lost in an instant. Through these expulsions, the Jewish people carried with them not only their Torah and traditions, but also an unshakable resilience. They would rebuild in new lands, adapt to new rulers, and continue their story, even when forced to wander. As Jewish communities were expelled from England, France, and Spain, and as life in much of Western Europe grew increasingly intolerable, the center of Jewish life shifted eastward. From the late Middle Ages into the early modern period, Poland and Lithuania became the heartland of the Jewish world. Here, in forests and towns far from the hostility of Western kingdoms, Jews found a measure of safety, autonomy, and cultural renewal. The invitation came from kings and nobles who saw opportunity. In the 13th and 14th centuries, Polish rulers issued charters granting Jews the right to settle, trade, and practice their faith. These charters promised protection under the law, allowing Jewish communities to govern their own affairs. Unlike in the West, where Jews were often expelled or confined to ghettos, Poland welcomed them as valuable contributors to its growing economy. By the 16th century, it is estimated that more than half of the world's Jews lived in Poland and Lithuania. Life here developed a unique rhythm. Jews settled in towns and villages known as shtetls, small communities that revolved around the synagogue, the marketplace, and the study hall. The shtetl became the beating heart of Jewish Eastern Europe, where daily life was steeped in tradition, learning, and communal solidarity. Men debated Torah in study houses, women kept households bound by faith and ritual, and children absorbed the melodies of prayers and the discipline of Hebrew letters. Self-governance was central to this world. The kahal, or community council, managed taxes, education, charity, and relations with non-Jewish authorities. On a larger scale, Jewish communities created the Council of Four Lands, a kind of parliament that represented Jews to the Polish crown. This system of communal autonomy was unique in Europe, giving Jews both responsibility and protection. They could live as a distinct people within a wider society, preserving their traditions while adapting to their surroundings. Economically, Jews filled vital roles. Many served as middlemen in trade, leasing estates from nobles, managing taverns, or handling agricultural produce. Though these positions sometimes placed them between peasants and landlords, a situation that could later fuel resentment, they provided livelihoods and allowed communities to thrive. Scholars and rabbis flourished as well, turning Poland and Lithuania into great centers of Jewish learning. Yeshivas, religious academies, produced rabbis whose influence reached across the Jewish world. Culturally, this was an age of creativity. Jewish printers established presses that spread texts of Torah and Talmud. New customs and commentaries enriched religious life. Songs and stories circulated through the shtetl, blending joy with longing for Zion. Despite periodic hardships, pogroms, and outbreaks of anti-Jewish violence, Jews in Poland and Lithuania built a vibrant civilization that endured for centuries. To many, this era felt like a promised land in exile. Here, Jews could live openly as Jews, shaping a distinct culture that would leave an enduring mark on history. In the towns and fields of Eastern Europe, a new Jewish heartland was born, one that would sustain millions until the storms of modern history came crashing down. As Jewish life blossomed in Poland and Lithuania, a new foundation of strength emerged: the yeshiva. These academies of study became the intellectual and spiritual engines of Eastern European Jewry, producing scholars, rabbis, and leaders whose influence spread across the Jewish world. If the shtetl was the heart of daily Jewish existence, the yeshiva was its mind, a place where tradition was sharpened, debated, and passed on to new generations. The roots of this tradition reached back to earlier centuries, but in Eastern Europe it took on a new vibrancy. By the 16th century, great centers of learning arose in cities like Lublin, Krakow, and Vilna. These yeshivas attracted students from far and wide, young men who traveled long distances and endured hardship for the chance to study Torah and Talmud under renowned masters. In drafty halls lit by candles, students debated deep into the night, their voices rising in passionate argument, their lives consumed by the pursuit of wisdom. The Talmud was their central text, not simply a book, but a vast ocean of law, commentary, and debate. Study was not passive. It was dialectical, a method of constant questioning. A student would present a passage, another would challenge its meaning, and together they would wrestle with interpretations, exploring logic and nuance. This way of study, called pilpul, honed the mind, teaching not only religious law but also discipline, reasoning, and creativity. Great figures arose in this world. Rabbi Yaakov Polak pioneered the pilpul method in Poland. Rabbi Shlomo Luria, known as the Maharshal, refined Jewish law in Lublin. And perhaps most famous, Rabbi Moshe Israels of Krakow, the Rema, wrote glosses to the Shulchan Aruch, the great code of Jewish law, adapting it for Ashkenazi practice. His work ensured that Jews in Eastern Europe would have a guide that balanced tradition with their own customs, anchoring their communities in shared law. The yeshivas were not ivory towers, detached from ordinary life. Their rulings shaped the rhythms of the shtetl. Questions about contracts, marriage, inheritance, or daily observance flowed from the people to the rabbis, and from the rabbis into the academies. In this way, scholarship was woven directly into the life of the community, ensuring that law and learning remained living forces rather than relics. Support for these institutions came from the communities themselves. Wealthier Jews often funded students, seeing it as a sacred duty to support Torah study. Towns took pride in the reputation of their local scholars, and sending a son to a renowned yeshiva was a mark of honor. The yeshiva became not only a school but a symbol, proof that even in exile, Jews could nurture intellectual greatness. Over time, Eastern Europe became the global center of Jewish learning, rivaling even the ancient academies of Babylon. The yeshivas preserved tradition, strengthened identity, and produced leaders who could guide communities through times of peace and persecution alike. In the wooden halls of Poland and Lithuania, by candlelight and in the hum of debate, a legacy was forged, one that would sustain Jewish life for centuries to come. While the yeshivas of Poland and Lithuania nurtured legal scholarship and communal leadership, another spiritual current was flowing through Jewish life: mysticism. Rooted in ancient traditions but flowering anew in the 16th century, Jewish mysticism, known as Kabbalah, offered a vision of the universe in which every prayer, every action, and every soul played a role in the cosmic drama of creation and redemption. Its center was not in Europe, but in the hills of Galilee in the town of Safed. Safed, perched high in northern Israel, became a refuge for Jews fleeing the traumas of the Spanish expulsion of 1492. Survivors carried with them grief, longing, and a search for meaning after the devastation of exile. In this mountain town, amid narrow streets and synagogues of stone, mystics, poets, and scholars gathered. Here they wove a new spiritual tapestry that would inspire Jews across the world. One of the earliest leaders of Safed was Rabbi Joseph Caro, who authored the Shulchan Aruch, the definitive code of Jewish law. Yet even as he anchored halakhic practice, he also opened himself to mystical experiences, claiming to receive visions from a heavenly mentor. His fusion of law and mysticism symbolized the atmosphere of Safed, where rigorous tradition blended with spiritual longing. But it was Rabbi Isaac Luria, known simply as the Ari, the Lion, who transformed Jewish mysticism into a system of breathtaking depth. Arriving in Safed in the mid-16th century, Luria taught a vision of creation in which God had contracted himself to make space for the world, a process called tzimtzum. Into this space, divine light flowed, but the vessels meant to contain it shattered, scattering sparks of holiness throughout the universe. Humanity's role, Luria taught, was to gather these sparks through acts of righteousness, prayer, and devotion, a process called tikkun olam, the repair of the world. This vision electrified Jewish imagination. Suddenly, exile was not just punishment, but part of a cosmic plan. Every mitzvah, every prayer, every act of kindness became a step in restoring harmony to creation. In a time of suffering and dislocation, Luria's teachings gave hope and purpose, binding ordinary life to divine destiny. Saif's mystics also reshaped Jewish worship. They composed new prayers and melodies, including the beloved hymn Lecha Dodi, welcoming the Sabbath as a bride. They introduced midnight vigils of prayer and study, weeping for the destruction of the temple while seeking spiritual renewal. Their practices spread quickly, reaching Europe, North Africa, and beyond. Though Saif's golden moment was brief, its influence was lasting. The teachings of Luria and his disciples became foundational to later mystical traditions, inspiring movements from Hasidism in Eastern Europe to modern spiritual seekers. Saif itself remained a symbol, a place where exile met transcendence, where Jewish creativity turned sorrow into song, and where mysticism lit a path of hope. In the narrow alleys of Saif, beneath its bright Galilean sky, Jewish mysticism reached new heights, reminding a scattered people that even in exile, they were part of a story written in the stars. The flourishing of Jewish life in Poland and Lithuania during the 16th and early 17th centuries was not to last unchallenged. In 1648, a storm of violence erupted across the Ukrainian lands that would scar Jewish memory for generations. This was the Cossack Uprising, led by Bogdan Khmelnytsky, a revolt against Polish nobility that unleashed catastrophic destruction upon Jewish communities caught in the middle. The Jews of Eastern Europe often lived as intermediaries in the feudal system. Many served as leaseholders of estates, tax collectors, or tavern keepers for Polish nobles, roles that made them visible and resented among the Ukrainian peasantry. To the rebels, Jews came to symbolize the oppressive system itself, and when revolt broke out, they bore the brunt of its fury. Khmelnytsky's Cossacks, allied with Tatars, swept across the countryside with terrifying speed. Towns and villages that had bustled with Jewish life were engulfed in flames. In Nemiriv, Tulchin, and countless other towns, entire communities were massacred. Chroniclers describe scenes of horror. Synagogues burned with worshippers inside, families cut down in the streets, and survivors sold into slavery. The Jewish chronicles of the time, known as Gevurat Hashem, the mighty acts of God, record these calamities with trembling voices. Estimates vary, but tens of thousands of Jews were killed, and countless others displaced. To many, it seemed as if another destruction of Jerusalem had come upon them, not by Rome this time, but by neighbors with whom they had once coexisted uneasily. This wave of violence coincided with a broader crisis in the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, known as the Deluge. Wars with Sweden, Russia, and internal rebellions left the region devastated. For Jews, the Khmelnytsky massacres were the most immediate trauma, but famine, plague, and ongoing conflict compounded their suffering. Communities that had taken centuries to build were wiped out in months. The psychological impact was immense. Jewish leaders wrestled with theological questions. How could God allow such devastation? Some saw it as punishment for sins, others as a sign of messianic times. Indeed, in the aftermath, messianic fervor surged, culminating in the rise of false messiahs like Shabbatai Tzvi in the later 17th century. The yearning for redemption burned more intensely in the wake of such despair. And yet, even amid ruin, survival persisted. Some communities rebuilt, scarred but determined. Rabbis worked to reestablish yeshivas, to restore courts of law, and to comfort the bereaved. Jewish families fled westward, seeking safety in places like Germany, Bohemia, and beyond. Out of tragedy, new centers of Jewish life slowly emerged, carrying with them the memory of the slain. The Khmelnytsky uprising became etched into Jewish memory as one of the great catastrophes of exile, a grim reminder that prosperity in diaspora was always fragile. The 17th century, once a time of growth, became an age of sorrow. And yet, the Jewish story did not end there. Through mourning and rebuilding, the people continued their journey, carrying both the weight of grief and the flame of resilience. The tragedies of the 17th century left deep scars upon the Jewish people of Eastern Europe. the massacres of the Cossack uprisings, the chaos of wars, famine, and plague. All of these had shaken communities to their core. Poverty was widespread, despair heavy, and many ordinary Jews felt distant from the world of elite rabbinic scholarship that dominated the yeshivas. In this atmosphere of grief and yearning, a new movement arose in the 18th century, a movement that would bring renewal, joy, and spiritual intimacy. This was Hasidism. At its heart stood Rabbi Israel ben Eliezer, later known as the Baal Shem Tov, Master of the Good Name. Born around 1700 in the Carpathian Mountains, he grew up amid hardship, but became a healer, mystic, and teacher who emphasized that God could be found not only in the study hall, but in every corner of life. The Baal Shem Tov taught that prayer, song, and simple faith could lift a soul as high as scholarly mastery. To him, the poor villager whispering psalms in the fields was as beloved before God as the rabbi debating Talmudic intricacies. The message was revolutionary. Where despair had reigned, the Baal Shem Tov spoke of joy. Where learning had seemed distant, he spoke of closeness to God through sincerity. Where exile had felt crushing, he proclaimed that every moment carried divine sparks waiting to be uplifted. His followers spread these teachings, turning them into a vibrant movement that soon transformed Jewish life in Eastern Europe. Hasidism emphasized community around charismatic leaders, known as rebbes or tzaddikim. These figures were seen not only as teachers, but as spiritual guides whose lives embodied holiness. Followers flocked to their courts, seeking blessings, wisdom, and inspiration. Each Hasidic dynasty developed its own customs, melodies, and stories, weaving a rich tapestry of traditions that gave meaning to everyday life. Prayer and music became central expressions. Hasidim sang niggunim, wordless melodies that stirred the heart and lifted the spirit. They gathered in circles of song and dance, turning worship into celebration. They spoke of devakut, cleaving to God not as an abstract idea, but as an experience that could be felt in joy, in love, and even in the simplest acts of daily living. The movement was not without opposition. Traditional rabbinic authorities, the mitnagdim, opponents, criticized Hasidism for what they saw as emotional excess and neglect of rigorous study. They feared that devotion to rebbes could border on idolatry. Fierce debates broke out, dividing communities. Yet over time, Hasidism proved too powerful to suppress. Its energy spread across Poland, Ukraine, Galicia, and beyond, becoming a defining force of Jewish Eastern Europe. By the close of the 18th century, Hasidism had become more than a movement. It was a way of life. It offered hope in a time of despair, warmth in the cold of exile, and a path to encounter the divine in every breath. In the face of centuries of sorrow, Hasidism lit a new flame, a reminder that joy, song, and faith could carry a people through even the darkest nights. By the late 18th century, Europe was in the throes of transformation. The Enlightenment, a movement championing reason, science, and individual rights, reshaped politics, philosophy, and society. For Jews, who had lived for centuries in ghettos, shtetls, and segregated quarters, this new age posed both promise and challenge. Out of it emerged the Haskalah, the Jewish Enlightenment, a movement that sought to bring Jews into the modern world while redefining their identity. The roots of the Haskalah lay in Western Europe, particularly in Germany. Here, Jewish communities had long faced restrictions, confined to specific trades, excluded from universities, and marked as outsiders by law and custom. But Enlightenment thinkers like Moses Mendelssohn, often called the father of the Jewish Enlightenment, challenged both Jewish insularity and Christian prejudice. A philosopher fluent in Hebrew, German, and classical languages, Mendelssohn embodied the ideal of a Jew who could remain faithful to his heritage while fully participating in European intellectual life. Mendelssohn argued that Judaism was not opposed to reason, but in harmony with it. He promoted secular education alongside religious study and encouraged Jews to learn the languages and cultures of the societies in which they lived. His translation of the Hebrew Bible into German, written in Hebrew script, symbolized the bridging of two worlds, offering Jews access to European culture while preserving a link to their traditions. The Haskalah spread across Jewish communities, urging reforms in education, dress, and social customs. Masculine, proponents of the Enlightenment, called for schools that taught science, mathematics, and modern languages alongside Torah. They encouraged Jews to leave the insularity of the ghetto, to engage in commerce, the arts, and public life. For the first time in centuries, some Jews began to imagine themselves not only as members of a scattered people, but as citizens of the nations in which they lived. Yet the movement also sparked tension. Traditional rabbis feared that the Haskalah would weaken Jewish law and faith. They warned that opening the door to European culture might lead to assimilation and the erosion of sacred identity. This tension between tradition and modernity, between yeshiva and enlightenment school, between the synagogue and the salon, became one of the defining struggles of Jewish life in the modern era. The impact of the Haskalah was profound. In places where governments enacted reforms, Jews slowly gained civil rights. The ability to attend universities, serve in professions, and live outside ghettos. Synagogues in some cities adopted new forms of worship, with sermons in the vernacular, choirs, and more structured services, precursors to later Reform Judaism. At the same time, Jews remained caught between hope and hostility, as emancipation was often partial, conditional, or followed by backlash. The Jewish Enlightenment opened the door to a new world. It introduced the dream that Jews could be both modern citizens and faithful to their heritage, both Germans, Frenchmen, Poles, and Jews. Yet it also set in motion debates that would shape the centuries to come. How to balance tradition with progress, faith with reason, particular identity with universal ideals. The Haskalah was the beginning of modern Jewish history, a dawn that promised freedom, but also uncertainty, in a rapidly changing world. The Enlightenment had opened the door to possibility, but the 19th century was where the promise of Jewish emancipation, the granting of civil rights and equality, became a central struggle. Across Europe, Jews pressed for recognition as full citizens of the states in which they lived. Their path, however, was uneven. Victories in some lands, setbacks in others, and always the tension between acceptance and exclusion. In France, the Revolution of 1789 marked a turning point. The ideals of liberty, equality, and fraternity inspired debates about whether Jews, long marginalized, could become citizens. In 1791, the National Assembly declared that Jews were to be granted full rights, making France the first European nation to emancipate its Jewish population. For French Jews, this was transformative. Ghettos were dismantled, restrictions lifted, and new opportunities opened. Yet emancipation came with expectations. Jews were urged to assimilate, to leave behind communal autonomy, and to prove themselves loyal Frenchmen. Elsewhere, the process was slower. In the German states, emancipation advanced in fits and starts. Some regions opened universities and professions to Jews. Others clung to old restrictions. Philosophers and politicians debated whether Jews could be both members of the nation and faithful to their traditions. The Haskalah had encouraged integration, and many Jews embraced secular education, science, and the arts, eager to show that they could contribute fully to modern society. Yet backlash was frequent, and legal equality remained incomplete until the mid-19th century. In Austria, Emperor Joseph II's Edict of Toleration in 1782 had granted Jews certain rights, such as access to schools and professions, while still imposing limits. Full emancipation did not arrive until 1867. In Italy, Jews were confined to ghettos until the unification of the country in the 19th century, when walls were torn down and Jews entered civic life as citizens. Emancipation was not only a political process, but a social and cultural transformation. Jewish communities began to move out of ghettos into broader society, adopting local languages and participating in cultural life. Some families rose to prominence in banking, commerce, and the arts. The Rothschilds, for example, became symbols of both Jewish success and the envy it provoked. Jewish intellectuals, scientists, and writers contributed to European culture at large, embodying the hopes of emancipation. But emancipation carried its dilemmas. To be accepted as citizens, Jews were often urged to abandon aspects of communal distinctiveness. The pressure to assimilate gave rise to debates within Jewish life. Should they adapt religious practices to fit modern norms, as Reform Judaism advocated? Or should they resist assimilation and cling tightly to tradition, as Orthodox leaders insisted? These debates reflected the deeper struggle of modernity itself, how to balance integration with identity. Even as emancipation advanced, anti-Semitism did not vanish, it adapted. Jews could now sit in parliaments and teach in universities, but caricatures and suspicions followed them. In many places, the promise of equality proved fragile, subject to political winds. The 19th century, then, was an age of both liberation and unease. Emancipation opened doors and created new possibilities, but it also raised new questions. What did it mean to be both Jewish and fully European? Could the dream of equality survive the persistence of prejudice? These questions would define Jewish life as the modern world unfolded. The struggle for emancipation in the 19th century was not only political but spiritual. As Jews stepped into modern society, questions arose that had no easy answers. How could they preserve their identity while embracing the new freedoms of citizenship? How could they remain true to ancient traditions while adapting to modern culture? Out of these questions emerged new movements within Judaism, each offering different visions for the future. The first and most radical was Reform Judaism, which took root in Germany in the early 19th century. Inspired by the ideals of the Enlightenment, Reform leaders sought to modernize Jewish practice to harmonize with European society. They emphasized ethical teachings over ritual law, seeing Judaism less as a set of strict commandments and more as a moral and spiritual tradition. Synagogues introduced sermons in German instead of Hebrew, added choirs and organs to services, and shortened prayers to fit the rhythm of modern life. Some Reform leaders even proposed moving the Sabbath to Sunday or abandoning circumcision, though such ideas remained controversial. The goal of Reform was integration, to show that Jews could be both modern citizens and faithful to their heritage. Yet this very adaptation sparked deep concern among more traditional Jews, who feared that Reform would strip Judaism of its core and lead to assimilation. In response, Orthodox Judaism crystallized as a distinct path. Orthodox leaders insisted that Jewish law, halakha, was binding in every generation, unchanging despite the tides of history. Figures like Rabbi Samson Raphael Hirsch of Frankfurt emphasized the principle of Torah im derech eretz, Torah with the way of the land, encouraging Jews to engage with modern society in education and work, but without compromising the authority of tradition. For Orthodoxy, the Torah and the commandments were eternal, and while Jews could adapt externally to their surroundings, their inner lives and practices had to remain rooted in divine law. Caught between these two poles, a middle path emerged: conservative Judaism, known as positive historical Judaism in its early form. This movement accepted the authority of Jewish law but argued that law itself had always evolved throughout history. Conservative thinkers believed Judaism could adapt to modern life without abandoning its roots. They sought to preserve Hebrew in worship while allowing for innovation, to uphold tradition while recognizing historical change. These three movements, Reform, Orthodox, and Conservative, represented more than theological differences. They reflected the broader struggles of Jews in the modern age: how to balance faith with freedom, how to preserve identity while entering the mainstream of European and later American society. Families were divided, communities split, synagogues argued. But through these debates, Judaism proved itself dynamic and resilient, able to respond creatively to the challenges of modernity. By the close of the 19th century, the diversity of Jewish life had expanded. No longer was there only one way to be Jewish. There were multiple paths, each striving to answer the same question: how to be a people of covenant in a modern world. The 19th century was, for Jews, a paradoxical age. On one hand, emancipation was advancing across Europe, unlocking doors to universities, professions, and political life. On the other hand, a darker force was taking shape: modern anti-Semitism. Unlike the old religious hostility that branded Jews as Christ killers or heretics, this new form drew upon nationalism, pseudoscience, and social anxiety. It was not about theology but about race, economics, and politics, and it proved just as deadly. In Western and Central Europe, where Jews had begun to enter civic life, resentment grew. As Jews became more visible as bankers, lawyers, and intellectuals, Anti-Semites painted them as a sinister force manipulating society. The language of racism, fueled by new theories of blood and race science, recast Jews as an alien people who could never truly belong. Newspapers, pamphlets, and caricatures spread these ideas widely, embedding them in public discourse. One of the most infamous cases came in France, the Dreyfus Affair. In 1894, Alfred Dreyfus, a Jewish officer in the French army, was falsely accused of treason. Despite flimsy evidence, he was convicted, stripped of his rank, and exiled. The case divided France, exposing deep veins of anti-Semitism even in the land that had first granted Jews emancipation. Though Dreyfus was eventually exonerated, the affair revealed how fragile Jewish acceptance remained, a reminder that citizenship could be questioned at any moment. In the German-speaking world, anti-Semitism took on political form. Parties and movements arose that explicitly targeted Jews, portraying them as enemies of the nation. The word anti-Semitism itself was coined in this era by Wilhelm Marr, who sought to frame Jew hatred not as prejudice but as a rational defense of society against an alien race. This shift from religious to racial terms would have devastating consequences in the century to follow. In Eastern Europe, the situation was even more violent. There, emancipation was incomplete, and Jews remained confined to the Pale of Settlement in the Russian Empire, a vast region stretching from Lithuania to Ukraine where millions of Jews lived under restrictive laws. Poverty was endemic, and resentment brewed among local populations. When crises struck, crop failures, economic downturns, political unrest, Jews were scapegoated. From the 1880s onward, waves of pogroms, violent mob attacks, swept through Russian and Ukrainian towns. Synagogues were torched, shops looted, families beaten and murdered. Authorities often turned a blind eye or worse, encouraged the violence. The infamous Kishinev pogrom of 1903 shocked the world with its brutality, leaving dozens dead and hundreds wounded, and searing itself into Jewish consciousness as a symbol of vulnerability. These pogroms spurred new responses. Many Jews fled, emigrating in vast numbers to Western Europe, the United States, and Palestine. Others turned to new movements for survival and renewal: socialism, Zionism, or renewed religious life. The age of modern anti-Semitism made clear that emancipation had not ended Jewish exile. It had merely changed its form. Thus, the 19th century closed with a bitter lesson. Even as Jews embraced modernity, modernity could turn against them. The promise of equality was real, but so too was the persistence of hatred, now armed with new ideologies that would shape the tragedies of the coming century. As the 19th century drew to a close, the Jewish world stood at a crossroads. Centuries of exile and persecution had left deep scars, and while emancipation offered hope in some countries, anti-Semitism continued to stalk the lives of Jews across Europe. Pogroms in the Russian Empire, racial theories in Germany, and scandals like the Dreyfus Affair in France made clear that the promise of acceptance was fragile. Out of this crisis, a new vision was born, the idea that Jews could no longer rely on the goodwill of others, but must build a homeland of their own. This was the birth of Zionism. The intellectual roots of Zionism stretched back centuries, rooted in the prayers of exile. Next year in Jerusalem, for generations, Jews had longed for return, but in the late 19th century, this longing took on a modern political form. Influenced by the rise of nationalism across Europe, Jewish thinkers began to argue that Jews, too, were not merely a religious group, but a people, a nation deserving of sovereignty and land. One of the earliest voices was Rabbi Yehuda Alkalai, who in the mid-19th century urged Jews to actively work toward resettling the land of Israel. Later, figures like Leon Pinsker gave the idea sharper urgency. In his pamphlet Auto-Emancipation, 1882, Pinsker declared that anti-Semitism was a permanent disease of European society and that Jews would never be secure until they had a homeland. His call resonated deeply with Jews who had seen pogroms devastate communities across Russia. But it was Theodor Herzl, an Austrian journalist, who became the face of political Zionism. Shaken by the Dreyfus Affair and the sight of mobs chanting "Death to the Jews" in supposedly enlightened Paris, Herzl concluded that assimilation had failed. In 1896, he published Der Judenstaat, the Jewish State, arguing that the only solution was the establishment of a Jewish nation-state. The following year, he convened the First Zionist Congress in Basel, Switzerland, gathering delegates from across Europe to formally launch the Zionist movement. Herzl wrote in his diary afterward, "At Basel, I founded the Jewish state. The movement sparked excitement and controversy. Some Jews embraced Zionism as the fulfillment of ancient hopes and a practical answer to modern persecution. Others, particularly in Western Europe, feared it would undermine their hard-won emancipation by portraying Jews as outsiders. Traditional rabbis, too, sometimes opposed it, arguing that return to Zion should await the Messiah, not human political action. Meanwhile, pioneers were already taking steps. In the 1880s, small groups of Jewish settlers, many from Eastern Europe, began migrating to Ottoman-controlled Palestine. Known as the First Aliyah, they established agricultural villages, often with great hardship. Though small in number, these settlers planted the seeds of what would become a new Jewish presence in the ancestral land. Zionism was more than politics, it was a rebirth of identity. It called for reviving Hebrew as a spoken language, for building not just a state but a culture. It was at once ancient and modern, rooted in biblical dreams yet shaped by nationalist movements of the 19th century. As the century closed, Jews faced a choice: continue the struggle for equality in Europe, or take up the banner of Zion and seek renewal in the land of their ancestors. This choice would shape Jewish destiny in the 20th century and beyond. The dawn of the 20th century found the Jewish people spread across the globe, their lives shaped by migration, culture, and the enduring search for security. From the shtetls of Eastern Europe to the bustling streets of New York, from the salons of Vienna to the kibbutzim in Ottoman Palestine, Jewish identity was undergoing profound transformation. Between 1880 and 1924, waves of Jewish emigration reshaped the map of the Jewish world. Driven by pogroms in the Russian Empire, poverty in Eastern Europe, and new opportunities abroad, nearly 2.5 million Jews left their ancestral homes. The majority sailed for the United States, where cities like New York, Chicago, and Philadelphia became vibrant centers of Jewish life. Lower East Side tenements overflowed with new arrivals, who worked in sweatshops, opened shops, and built synagogues. Despite hardship, these immigrants carried with them the rhythms of Yiddish speech, the melodies of Eastern Europe, and the determination to carve out a better life. Others traveled to South America, settling in Argentina and Brazil, where Jewish agricultural colonies dotted the pampas. Some journeyed to South Africa, lured by opportunities in trade and mining. A smaller but determined group made their way to Ottoman-controlled Palestine, laying the foundations of a new Jewish presence in the ancient homeland. The early 20th century was also a cultural renaissance for the Jewish people. In Europe, Yiddish literature blossomed, with writers like Sholem Aleichem capturing the humor and hardship of shtetl life. His stories of Tevi, the dairyman, would later inspire Fiddler on the Roof, a tale of tradition and change beloved across the world. Hebrew, long confined to sacred texts, was reborn as a spoken language under visionaries like Eliezer ben Yehuda in Jerusalem. Newspapers, theaters, and schools in both Yiddish and Hebrew flourished, giving voice to Jewish creativity in modern forms. Meanwhile, in Western Europe, Jewish thinkers, artists, and scientists made remarkable contributions to broader culture. Sigmund Freud developed psychoanalysis in Vienna. Albert Einstein revolutionized physics. Musicians, painters, and philosophers carried Jewish influence into the fabric of modern thought, demonstrating both the promise and the peril of integration in societies that still harbored prejudice. This era was marked by a tension between hope and vulnerability. In America and parts of Western Europe, Jews achieved new freedoms, building institutions and entering professions once barred to them. Yet in Eastern Europe, millions still faced grinding poverty, legal restrictions, and outbreaks of violence. Anti-Semitism adapted to the modern age, sometimes cloaked in racial theories or nationalist ideologies, threatening to undo the gains of emancipation. At the same time, new political movements competed for Jewish allegiance. Socialists urged solidarity with the working class. Bundists, a Jewish socialist movement, promoted Yiddish culture and labor rights. Zionists dreamed of a homeland in Palestine. Each path reflected different answers to the same question: How could Jews secure their future in a turbulent world? As the 20th century unfolded, the Jewish people stood at a pivotal moment. They had carried their traditions into new lands, embraced modern culture, and built flourishing communities across continents. Yet beneath the achievements lay uncertainty. The coming decades would bring war, revolution, and catastrophe, events that would test Jewish resilience as never before. When the First World War erupted in 1914, it upended the world order, tearing apart empires and reshaping nations. For the Jewish people scattered across Europe, the Middle East, and beyond, the war was both a tragedy and a turning point. It forced Jewish communities into the crossfire of empires, unleashed waves of displacement, and sowed seeds that would influence Jewish destiny for decades to come. Jews lived across all the great powers that marched into war. Millions were subjects of the Russian Empire, while others lived in Germany, Austria-Hungary, Britain, and France. This meant Jewish soldiers fought on both sides of the trenches, sometimes even against one another. Brothers in faith wore opposing uniforms, saluted different flags, and spilled blood for nations that had long treated them as outsiders. The war magnified the question of Jewish identity. Were they first Jews or first citizens of their respective countries? The Eastern Front, stretching across Poland, Ukraine, and the Baltic states, was home to dense Jewish populations. Here, the war was particularly devastating. Towns and shtetls became battlefields, subjected to invasions, requisitions, and reprisals. Russian authorities accused Jews of spying for Germany and Austria, leading to mass expulsions from border regions. Hundreds of thousands were uprooted, forced to march eastward into the Russian interior with little more than what they could carry. Starvation, disease, and despair followed these wandering refugees. Meanwhile, in occupied territories, Jews endured plunder and violence from both advancing and retreating armies. Synagogues and homes were destroyed, businesses collapsed, and communities that had thrived for centuries faced ruin. For many, World War I felt like yet another chapter of exile and persecution, magnified by the chaos of modern warfare. Amid the suffering, the war accelerated the political awakening of the Jewish people. Zionism, already stirring in the late 19th century, gained urgency. The plight of Jewish refugees and the persistence of anti-Semitism underscored the need for a homeland. In 1917, Britain issued the Balfour Declaration, expressing support for the establishment of a national home for the Jewish people in Palestine. Though vague and contested, this statement marked the first official endorsement of Zionist aspirations by a major world power, planting a seed for future developments. At the same time, the Russian Revolution of 1917 brought new upheaval. While it toppled the Tsarist regime that had oppressed Jews for centuries, it also unleashed waves of violence in the civil war that followed. Pogroms, especially in Ukraine, killed tens of thousands between 1918 and 1921, showing that liberation from empire did not guarantee safety. World War I shattered illusions. Jews had marched into battle hoping their sacrifices would secure full acceptance in their nations. But as the dust settled, anti-Semitism persisted, and in Eastern Europe, it even intensified. Yet out of the war also came new opportunities. The growth of Jewish political movements, the beginnings of large-scale migration to Palestine, and the recognition that Jewish destiny was tied not only to exile, but to renewal. The war had devastated Jewish communities, but it had also redrawn the map of possibility. The old empires were gone. A new world was emerging. And in that world, the Jewish question, how to secure a future for a scattered people, would loom larger than ever. The end of World War I promised a new beginning, but for Jews across Europe and beyond, the interwar years became a time of both flourishing creativity and deepening danger. The collapse of empires, the rise of new nation-states, and the turbulence of economic and political upheaval created both opportunities and perils. In Eastern Europe, Jewish culture blossomed in ways unseen before. Yiddish theaters, newspapers, and literature flourished, capturing the struggles and humor of Jewish daily life. Writers like Isaac Bashevis Singer and poets of the Yiddish avant-garde explored themes of tradition, modernity, and exile. At the same time, Hebrew was reborn as a living language in Palestine, where schools, publishing houses, and new poetry infused ancient words with modern spirit. The shtetl still endured, but Jewish voices were no longer confined to it. They spoke to the world. Meanwhile, Jewish artists, scientists, and thinkers contributed to broader society with astonishing impact. In Berlin, Vienna, and New York, Jewish intellectuals shaped philosophy, psychology, and politics. Musicians like Arnold Schoenberg redefined sound. Filmmakers and playwrights used art to grapple with modern anxieties. In America, Jewish immigrants enriched popular culture, from Broadway musicals to the early Hollywood film industry. The new states that arose after World War I brought mixed realities for Jews. In places like Poland, Romania, and Hungary, millions of Jews became citizens for the first time, theoretically with equal rights. Yet these young nations often define themselves in nationalist terms, seeing minorities, including Jews, as outsiders. Political anti-Semitism surged, and in many regions Jews were restricted from professions, schools, and government service. In response, Jewish political movements gained strength. The Bund, a socialist Jewish workers' party, organized labor and promoted Yiddish culture. Zionist factions debated paths forward. Some advocated for immediate settlement in Palestine, while others envisioned cultural or political renewal in the diaspora. Religious Jews continued to preserve tradition, while reform and secular currents reshaped Jewish life in Western Europe and America. Diversity of opinion reflected the complexity of Jewish identity in a rapidly changing world. Despite the vibrancy of Jewish culture, shadows lengthened. Economic instability, particularly the Great Depression of the 1930s, fueled anti-Semitic scapegoating. In Eastern Europe, pogroms continued sporadically, and governments introduced harsh quotas limiting Jewish participation in universities and professions. Most ominously, in Germany, the rise of Adolf Hitler and the Nazi Party in the early 1930s transformed anti-Semitism into a political platform. Nazi ideology recast Jews not as a religious minority, but as a racial threat to national purity. Propaganda vilified them, laws stripped away rights, and violence loomed ever closer. What had once been prejudice and exclusion was now becoming state policy, a warning of horrors to come. The interwar years were thus a paradox. They saw Jewish creativity at its peak, from literature and science to politics and culture. At the same time, they saw the tightening grip of anti-Semitism, particularly in Eastern and Central Europe. For Jews, the interwar world was both a stage of brilliance and a trap of encroaching peril. The community did not yet know it, but the storm that was gathering would soon become the darkest chapter in their long history. The Holocaust, or Shoah, was the most devastating chapter in the long history of the Jewish people. Between 1941 and 1945, Nazi Germany and its collaborators sought not merely to persecute Jews, but to annihilate them entirely. This crime against humanity claimed 6 million Jewish lives, men, women, and children, and shattered centuries-old communities across Europe. The rise of Adolf Hitler in 1933 had already set Jewish life in Germany on a dangerous path. Jews were stripped of citizenship under the Nuremberg laws of 1935, excluded from professions, and subjected to propaganda that painted them as subhuman. Violence escalated with Kristallnacht in 1938, when synagogues were burned, businesses destroyed, and thousands sent to concentration camps. Yet what followed during World War II went far beyond persecution. After Germany invaded Poland in 1939, millions of Jews fell under Nazi control. Ghettos were established in cities like Warsaw, Lodz, and Vilna, forcing Jews into overcrowded, starving, disease-ridden quarters. Life became a daily struggle for survival, with smuggling, underground schools, and secret prayer sustaining dignity amid despair. But even the ghettos were only a step in a larger plan. In 1941, with the invasion of the Soviet Union, the Nazis unleashed Einsatzgruppen, mobile killing squads, that massacred entire Jewish communities in forests and fields. The mass shooting at Babi Yar near Kiev, where over 33,000 Jews were killed in 2 days, symbolized this phase of Holocaust by bullets. Soon after, the Nazis formalized their genocidal plan at the Wannsee Conference in 1942. The final solution, the systematic extermination of European Jewry. Industrialized murder followed. Camps like Auschwitz-Birkenau, Treblinka, Sobibor, and Majdanek were constructed as killing centers. Trains carried Jews from across Europe to these sites, where most were sent directly to gas chambers disguised as showers. Families were torn apart, possessions stolen, and bodies burned. Auschwitz alone consumed over 1 million lives. The camps also held forced laborers who endured starvation, brutality, and medical experiments. Survival was rare, but even in these conditions, prisoners clung to scraps of humanity, sharing food, preserving prayer, and recording testimonies that would later bear witness. Though faced with overwhelming odds, Jews resisted. In the Warsaw Ghetto uprising of 1943, fighters armed with smuggled weapons held off German troops for weeks, a symbol of defiance in the face of certain death. Partisans in forests of Eastern Europe launched guerrilla attacks against the Nazis, while others joined Soviet or Allied forces. Even small acts, preserving a Torah scroll, writing diaries, teaching children in secret, became forms of resistance against a regime bent on erasing Jewish life. When the war ended in 1945, Europe lay in ruins. Survivors emerged from camps and hiding places, skeletal and traumatized. Entire towns had vanished. Centuries of Jewish culture in Central and Eastern Europe were wiped away. The Holocaust left not only a staggering loss of life, but a wound in Jewish identity and world conscience that endures to this day. Yet even in the shadow of destruction, survivors rebuilt. They sought new homes in America, Palestine, and beyond, determined that the Jewish people would live on. The Holocaust had been an attempt to extinguish a nation, but it became, instead, a testament to Jewish endurance. The Holocaust had left the Jewish world shattered. 6 million lives were extinguished, communities erased, and survivors scattered across a ruined continent. When the war ended in 1945, the Jewish question was no longer about assimilation or emancipation, it was about survival itself. Yet from this devastation, new life emerged. The post-war years witnessed both the deep grief of displaced persons and the rebirth of Jewish sovereignty in the land of Israel. Liberated from camps and hiding places, survivors faced the unimaginable task of rebuilding their lives. Many had lost entire families, homes, and communities. Europe offered little welcome. Anti-Semitism still simmered, and many towns were hostile to returning Jews. As a result, hundreds of thousands crowded into displaced persons, DP camps, often in Germany, Austria, and Italy. Life in the DP camps was harsh. Overcrowded barracks, meager rations, and uncertain futures. But these camps also became sites of resilience. Survivors formed schools, synagogues, theaters, and newspapers. Marriages were celebrated, children were born, and Jewish culture began to revive amid the ruins. Organizations like the Joint Distribution Committee and the UN Relief and Rehabilitation Administration provided aid, while survivors organized politically, demanding the right to emigrate to new homelands. For many, the answer lay in Palestine. The dream of Zionism, born in the 19th century, now carried the urgency of survival. Britain, which controlled Palestine under mandate, limited Jewish immigration, citing Arab opposition. Yet Holocaust survivors and their supporters defied these restrictions, boarding clandestine ships in what became known as the Aliyah Bet. The most famous of these, the Exodus 1947, carried thousands before being turned back by the British, an event that galvanized international sympathy for the Jewish cause. In 1947, the United Nations voted to partition Palestine into Jewish and Arab states. The Jewish leadership, though divided, accepted the plan. The Arab leadership rejected it. On May 14, 1948, David Ben-Gurion proclaimed the establishment of the State of Israel. For the first time in nearly 2 millennia, the Jewish people had a sovereign homeland. The birth of Israel was both triumph and trial. Immediately, surrounding Arab states launched an invasion, sparking the War of Independence. Against great odds, the fledgling state survived, securing its place on the map. Hundreds of thousands of Jews, including Holocaust survivors and refugees from Arab lands, poured into Israel, beginning the process of nation-building. For them, the state represented not only a refuge, but the fulfillment of ancient hopes. At the same time, Jewish life outside Israel was also taking new shape. In the United States, which now housed the largest Jewish population in the world, communities grew strong and secure, building synagogues, schools, and institutions that would define American Jewish life. Europe, by contrast, remained a shadow of its former self. Its centuries-old centers diminished beyond repair. The aftermath of the Holocaust was a time of mourning, but also of rebirth. The Jewish people, nearly annihilated, had found the strength to begin again, in DP camps, in new diasporas, and in the reborn state of Israel. From ashes rose endurance. From despair, determination. The Jewish story once again refused to end. And so, from the covenant of Abraham beneath the stars to the modern rebirth of Israel, from exile and persecution to resilience and renewal, the Jewish story spans thousands of years. A saga of survival, faith, and hope. It is a reminder that history is not only about kingdoms and empires, but about a people who carried their identity through every trial and triumph. If you found this journey meaningful, please give this video a like. It really helps share these stories with more people. Don't forget to subscribe to Whispered Empires for more epic histories told in a way that helps you reflect, rest, and imagine. And I'd love to hear from you. What part of the Jewish story resonated with you the most? Drop your thoughts in the comments, or even just write the word resilience to let me know you made it to the end. Thank you for joining me on this journey through time. Until next time, may the whispers of history continue to inspire you.